We would like to begin tonight's hearing, and thank you for your patience in the... All right, listen to me very carefully, please. This is a big room, a lot of echoes. We want to respectfully be able to hear all of you so that we can hear. So you, please, I'm asking you not to talk while others are testifying here tonight. We won't be able to hear. Thank you again for your patience this evening. We will stay here as long as there are folk who wish to come forward and testify tonight. I also want to mention right at the start that we will hold a work session 1 week from tonight. I'm not sure yet the venue. Obviously, we had a little bit of a problem tonight, but we will have a work session. That means that we will all come back together, the committee and as many council members as wish to do so we can talk about what we heard tonight to begin to address next steps. It is the intention of the committee to move forward with the legislation in some fashion, a good fashion that works for the entire city. But we do intend to move forward with the legislation. It is important that everyone stays engaged in the process so that we hear clearly what the desires, concerns are of the citizenry. Tonight we're here to hear 3 bills around the Port Covington TIF, tax increment financing. We're hearing bill number, I'm sorry. Before I move forward, I'm Councilman Carl Stutz. I'm Councilman Carl Stutz, the chair of the Taxation Finance Economic Development Committee. 2 spaces to my left is the president of the City Council, Bernard C. Jack Young. To my immediate left is my colleague and vice chair of the committee, Councilman Bill Henry of the 4th Council District. I'm sorry. And Councilwoman Holton is next to President Young. Next to her is also a member of the committee. Next to her is Councilman Ed Reisinger, the 10th District.
Thank you, Mr.
Also
Chair.
a member of the committee. Next to the councilman to his left is Councilwoman Sharon Green Middleton of the 6th Council District.
Thank you.
And seated to her left is Councilwoman Mary Pat Clark of the 4th Council District. 2 spaces to my right is Councilman Jim Kraft of the 1st Council District. To his right is Councilman Scott of the 2nd, Brandon Scott of the 2nd Council District. To his left is Councilman Eric Costello of the 11th Council District. And to his right is Councilwoman Ricky Spector of the 5th District. Of course, to my immediate right is Jennifer Coates, who is staff to the committee. There are several other committee members here also this evening. Matter of fact, the entire legislative department or councilmanic services department is with us tonight, and we thank them for being a part of this. We also have with us this evening mayor representatives Calliope Potamus, and from the council president's office, Kara Kuntz, Paul Plymouth, and Carolyn Blakely. Thank you. We ask that we turn off all cell phones to prevent disruptions. There should be now a seat for everybody in the House. There is enough seats for everyone. Councilman, how are you? We've been joined by Councilman Warren Branch of the 13th Council District, also a member of this committee. If you intend to testify, please sign up. There is a sign-up sheet in the back of the auditorium. So let's go. We have before us 3 bills around the Port Covington Development District, and we'll be talking about what these bills mean and say in just a moment. But we're here for Council Bill 16-666, 0669, which is the Port Covington Development District. Again, we'll explain what each of the bills speak to. Council Bill 16-0670, Port Covington Bond Issuance, and then City Council Bill 16-0671, the Port Covington Special Taxing District. I'll give you a short order of the agenda for this evening. We're going to begin with the Baltimore Development Corporation and the Sagamore Development Corporation speaking jointly. William Bill Cole, the President and CEO, will take the lead and will work with the Sagamore Development Corporation representatives. After that, we will have the Department of Finance and MuniCap speak. At that point, we will hold testimony as the council may ask questions and speak to concerns. After that, we will have Tishla Baez come forward to speak in a panel, and they will have 10 minutes. Build will come forward. They will have 10 minutes. We will then have public testimony. We'll break in with public testimony, 2 minutes each, those who have signed up. We will then go back to our panel testimony for 10 minutes each, including the housing advocates, the labor union, and the Baltimore Urban League. And then we will return to public testimony for the rest of the evening. I think that's all of our housekeeping for this moment. The public restrooms are on the lower level. So Baltimore Development Corporation and Sagamore Development Corporation would come to us for about 10 minutes or so. William Bill Cole will begin.
Mr. Chairman, can everybody hear me? Mr. Chairman, Mr. President, members of the committee, and members of the council, it is a privilege and honor to be here today. This screen to my left, to many of your right, will have a brief presentation from the Baltimore Development Corporation that gives you the background for the project. Sagamore Development Corporation will follow me, and as the chairman said, the Department of Finance, Deputy Director Steve Krause will be last. I will, at the chairman's request, I've compressed what is usually a 30-minute presentation down to about 5. Much of the material that I present today is already available and is on the Department of Planning and has been presented elsewhere, Department of Finance. There's nothing new here today. So for the committee, for everybody, so that we understand, we're talking about the Port Covington site, which is the property south of Interstate 95. This is Hanover Street Bridge here. This is the Sun Paper printing facility, the old Walmart and the old Sam's Club, and the old City Garage for point of reference. So development summary, what we're talking about here is a 15 million square foot development, approximately 5.5 million square feet of office space, including 3.9 million for a new Under Armour World Headquarters, approximately 7,500 residential units, 1.5 million square feet of retail, 200 plus hotel rooms, and approximately 500,000 square feet of manufacturing and maker space. The project requires approximately 10,000 parking spaces. Sagamore Development is the lead developer for the horizontal construction of the project and is proposing the following public infrastructure improvements. This is over 17 new streets with 66 intersections, over 40 acres of parks, more than doubling the existing park network, utilities and site work, pedestrian and bike paths, and highway and transit improvements. The request for TIF financing, these numbers have been presented many times before, but I wanted to walk the committee through this. Private funding is anticipated at just under $328 million. State and federal funds are anticipated at just under $575 million. And the TIF bonds, the proceeds from the TIF bonds equals about $535 million. So that is what we refer to as the horizontal capital stack, $1.436 billion. So the leverage for private investment, and what we calculated in our but-for analysis, is that the $535 million in TIF bonds support $5.5 billion in vertical development. And that was our conservative estimate of the development potential of 260 acres of property in total. The existing street grid, I will pause here very quickly so the committee sees. I know Councilman Rice here and Councilman Costello know this well, but there's really one road that services the interior of the property right now. It's Cromwell Street. Of course, you have Hanover Street, the yellow road here, and there are a couple of arteries that dip down into the project. but certainly not sufficient infrastructure to handle the redevelopment of 260 urban acres. This is the proposed framework of the new street grid. The dark gray areas are development sites. I want to point out right here, the area to the south that looks, I guess, panhandle area is the Under Armour World Headquarters site. None of the TIF proceeds are being used to build that site. I think it's important for that to be repeated again and again. The infrastructure improvements support the vertical development north of the Under Armour site. The proposed park system that surrounds the property, waterfront access throughout, with the exception of the area in front of Lock Insulator, because that is not part of the project. It's privately owned. There's more than 100 jobs there. They will continue to operate there. If at some point in the future it is possible to connect it, I'm certain the city would like to do that, but right now the property is available, or is accessible to the water all the way around, with the exception of the part that is owned by Lock. And then the proposed bike and pedestrian network to be supported here. Obviously, we're talking about 66 new city blocks that have to be connected. There's a connection into South Baltimore to get over the rail lines. The goal would be to connect this project to Westport, whether it be through the swing bridge or some other way, and bike networks throughout so that the site is not exclusively accessible by car. The proposed transit system, the goal is to bring light rail into the site from Westport, an internal network to move people around through the site, and you'll see light rail stops, or water taxi stops at various spots. The goal obviously is if you're on the other side of the water, you'd be able to get to this site without having to get into a car. You could get there by boat. And this is the master plan that the Department of Planning and Planning Commission have approved as of right now. You see all the green space that we're talking about. This is the headquarters site here. This is Lock here, just to give you a frame of reference. And that is it from, Mr. Chairman, I think I kept to my 5-minute promise, so that's it from BDC. We're gonna go to Sagamore Development next, and I think I'm turning it over to Caroline Path.
Okay, thanks. Good evening, Mr. President, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, and council members. I'm Caroline Paff, Vice President at Sagamore Development Company. Thank you for the opportunity this evening to just spend a few minutes, and I will honor that, putting today's legislation in context. Port Covington has a tremendous potential to be transformed from the underutilized, environmentally challenged land to a thriving, active, inclusive waterfront community and economic catalyst for our city. It has the potential to be the permanent home and global headquarters of Baltimore's own Under Armour. And let me take just a moment to explain the difference between Sagamore and Under Armour. Although there is common ownership, Under Armour is a large publicly traded company, while Sagamore, the developer of this project, is a privately owned development company. With your support and approval, together we'll be able to fully restore Port Covington to productive use as an economic generator and community asset, both for our immediate neighbors, particularly the SB6 communities, and for the city as a whole. And while today is about the future, I do want to take a step back to Port Covington's past and present, because it does inform how we move forward with this redevelopment. I think John is going to lend a hand, and he's going to be my Vanna White down there. Another word for Vanna White. Yeah, we brought backup. So there we go. So the picture that you see on the board, and we may have on the screen in a moment, is actually a thriving Port Covington. Back in the day, it was probably taken in the 1940s or 1950s. It was a very active and productive rail yard. It had deep water access in parts, coal piers, and plenty of people working down there, though not living, but a lot of folks actually working down there. And what I mean about this actually informs the direction that we're going if you were able to take a close look at it, you'd notice that there wasn't a whole lot of environmental stewardship happening in that era. The rail lines leave behind diesel and a lot of other chemicals. The ecological challenges continue today, with the middle branch of the Patapsco River often has raw sewage in it, and not to mention the trash that you can see in the other photograph. I want to mention that adjacent communities participate in cleanups and removal of invasive weeds around the Middle Branch Basin, and we send our folks out every day to clean the shoreline areas we have access to. Rec and Parks does as well. But the efforts are underway to engage the next generation in learning through fun activities on the water. It's going to be a little difficult to actually see a lot of those. So on the left are kids from the lab school working on an oyster project at the Baltimore Yacht Basin. The top right are kids from Coldstream Park Elementary participating in a program called Bridges at City Garage with Workbench that's an educational technology company. And then the bottom right are kids from the Chesapeake Bay program kayaking out of the Middle Branch Park, a terrific kayaking and canoeing program that I'm sure Rec and Parks would love to discuss with you. Now, we have an opportunity to redevelop an area equal in size to about 45 city blocks and have an enormous and positive economic and environmental impact. I just keep checking to see if we're up yet. Okay. A redeveloped Port Covington will mean thousands of new jobs. John, I don't know that that board is very visible to the council members. Yeah, the print on it. It actually has some economic, I'll read you the economic impact. So the redeveloped Port Covington will mean thousands of new jobs, new businesses, better transit to jobs, more than 40 acres of park, new space for manufacturing, fresh opportunities for innovation and entrepreneurship, new ways to reach the waterfront, and more. More than 40% of the land in Port Covington redevelopment will be public green space and open space. This is unprecedented for Baltimore. 40% will be public space. The construction impacts, $7.6 billion in economic activity, supporting 42,000 jobs over the arc of the project. We're excited about that too. $3.3 billion in labor revenue alone. $3.3 billion in labor revenue alone. $242 million in state and local taxes and $108 million in taxes to Baltimore City. Ongoing employment impacts, so that's just the construction phases of the project. Ongoing employment, $4.3 billion in economic activity annually at full build out. 26,500 permanent jobs in Port Covington. $2.2 billion of labor income annually at full build out. And $209 million in state and local revenues with $94 million to Baltimore City annually at full build out. In your files is a letter from Neil Jorgens, the Vice President of Corporate Real Estate at Under Armour. I hope you have a chance to read it if you haven't read it already. I just want to read one line of it to you down at the bottom of the second page. Quote, "The current site with the existing infrastructure simply will not support the growth we see on the horizon and the 10,000 teammates needed to keep Under Armour at the cutting edge of innovation and design." Close quote. Under Armour is talking about the growth you see on, whoa, yay, on, now that's something to applaud. This is Under Armour's growth chart. This is what they're talking about, space to grow, and this is why. It's grow here or grow somewhere else. All of the folks involved in this project want that growth right here in Baltimore City. And we know that you do too. We know. Many people have asked and also speculated, why now and what's the rush? Look at the growth. Under Armour has aggressive growth plans, and we want to make it possible for the company to continue and create jobs in Baltimore and with Baltimore. Why can't we delay? Well, look at that slide. Under Armour is one of the fastest growing companies in the world and already has more than 2,200 employees in its 3 locations in Baltimore City. In addition to Under Armour's growth, Baltimore recently lost out on its fair share of federal highway dollars this year, and one of the main reasons is that we didn't have the local matching funds in hand. We expect another round before the end of the year, and TIF approval is more important now than ever. We also want to build on the momentum we've already developed. Michael's doing it for me? Okay, thank you. I'm gonna stop clicking, there we go. Thanks. These before and after photos, and all of you have been around Baltimore to see the transformation of some of the buildings at Port Covington. So the before and after on the top left is the old Sam's Club. Now, when that started out, Andy Frank at BDC with Walmart and Sam's, you know, you can debate it now whether or not it was a good idea, but he wanted to get something going there. And they planned a power center, really. 9/11 happened, the economy crashed, and it just never actually materialized. At the bottom is the old City Central Garage facility, which is now relocated over onto East Middle Street. But this is where the old fleet used to be maintained. People think it was the bus depot, it wasn't. It was the city fleets were actually maintained at this garage. Then you look at the pictures on the right. This is what Under Armour and Sagamore have done. Building 37 on the top right there, that's Under Armour location and part of their new campus. And there are already more than 500 employees working in that building today. City Garage, the bottom right, is about 135,000 square feet, half innovation space for Under Armour, and the other half has makers space, people who are actually doing things and making things. Not just creating apps, but creating things and creating jobs who are committed to staying in Maryland. In addition to this, a lot of people heard recently about Sagamore Rye and the whiskey distillery that's under construction. A lot of the trades that are here tonight are actually working on that job with us. The investment in the distillery is about $50 million. Add that to $14 million in City Garage, and we've also invested about $140 million in acquisition planning and design in Port Covington. It's a tremendous commitment on behalf of Sagamore Development and Under Armour to get this project underway. But continued momentum is dependent on approval of the TIF financing. I know you'll have questions about both costs and benefits this evening. Let me say just a word about the benefits. It's a great leveraging opportunity for the city. $535 million in public infrastructure, all in the public right-of-way, to leverage a $5.5 billion project. Without anything else, that's a good deal. But it's not without anything else. We've made numerous commitments, not all of which were required by city law. In fact, most were not required by city law, but we chose to engage into these commitments. I'm going to ask Alicia Wilson, our Vice President of Community Affairs, to review the benefits with you and some of the agreements that we've reached with communities and other organizations.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, other members of the City Council. My name is Alicia Wilson, and I am Vice President for Community Affairs and Legal Advisor for Sagamore Development. I am a proud Baltimorean. I grew up here, I still live here, I work here in this city, and I've dedicated my life to making Baltimore a better place, and I truly believe that Port Covington is a piece of that. Let me talk to you a little bit about this Sagamore's MOUs with the City of Baltimore, which I believe and we believe are making unprecedented commitments to our community. The first being on supplier diversity, minority business enterprises, and women business enterprises. We are committed to ensuring that minority business enterprises and women business enterprises are recruited, encouraged, and succeed in participating in Port Covington's redevelopment. We have and will continue to engage in robust discussions and dialogues with minority and business enterprise groups, which I believe that several individuals in the audience individuals and groups represented here today will testify to before you. Working in tandem with the Mayor's Office of Minority and Women-Owned Business, we are committed to ensuring that throughout construction and long-term operations at Port Covington, that minority and women-owned businesses know what contracting and professional services opportunities are available, that those contracts are appropriately sized so that minority and women-owned businesses are able to bid, compete, and participate. We are utilizing our Build Port Covington website to do intake and follow up with such contractors. With respect to inclusionary housing, we are committed to inclusionary housing efforts by setting a goal of 10% of affordable units at Port Covington available to households whose income is less than 80% of area median income. That is $69,400 for a family of 4 or $48,600 for a single person. Sagamore is also going to apply for low-income housing tax credits and other financial support for affordable housing to produce publicly subsidized affordable housing units available to households whose income is less than 60% of the area median income. That is $52,000 for a family of 4 or $36,400 for a single person. Now, the third MOU is with regard to local hiring. We have agreed to 51% of newly hired employees at Port Covington to be made up of Baltimore City residents. We have set a minimum goal of at least 20% of all on-site employees will be Baltimore City residents. Sagamore is committed to ensuring reliable and affordable transportation to the project, such as bus service, so that Baltimore City residents are able to access jobs at the site. Two things I want to just point out. We are providing MOED with $80,000 annually to employ a Port Covington local hiring coordinator and working with MOED on this workforce development, as well as starting this summer, 100 Baltimore youth were funded by Sagamore Development for youth work jobs this summer. Sagamore will also contribute $10 million towards citywide programs, initiatives focused on education, workforce development, and youth empowerment. And just last Friday, it gave me a lot of pleasure to present for the Cooper Foundation a $1 million gift to the College Bound Foundation for scholarships for Baltimore youth. And as you know, on July 14th, Sagamore announced a major partnership and financial commitment to the communities closest to the project, many of which have suffered disinvestment for years. Over more than a dozen meetings, we came together with leaders from Cherry Hill, Brooklyn, Lakeland, Mount Winans, Westport, and Curtis Bay. These communities were represented by the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, Enterprise Community Partners, and the Legal Aid Bureau. And we ensured that SB6 are not just our neighbors in this development, but our partners in the growth of Port Covington and the opportunity that will come with it. But this is really just more than about money. This is about a partnership between communities and unparalleled assistance to allow an advocacy from Sagamore working with those communities. We came to the table with a vision that self-determination for these communities was essential, and I hope to have the opportunity at some later point in this hearing to give you the details of that agreement. but I know that there are leaders and community members from these communities in attendance today that desire to testify about the work we have done together thus far and their hope for the future. I'm happy to answer any additional questions at any other time. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman, we're doing a quick change here on the presentations, and I'm introducing Steve Kraus, the Deputy Director of Finance, who is also Clerk to the Board of Finance. Mr. Kraus.
Thank you, Mr. Kraus.
Thank you, Mr. Cole. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, and general public, it's great to see everyone here tonight. What I want to do is basically walk you through the Port Covington analysis that the Department of Finance did, and as well as the Board of Finance. But before I get into the details on Port Covington, I wanted to describe first how a TIF works, so as we get into the details, you get a better understanding of the process. What is tax increment financing? Essentially what it is, what drives the engine of tax increment financing is a significant investment, capital investment by a private developer to create new assessment, new construction. And that new construction and that new assessment creates additional tax revenues that the city is not currently receiving. It is that additional assessment and tax revenues that allows us to then borrow the money that will then fund the infrastructure that will support the project. And that's essentially what this slide is saying. It creates, at the bottom point here, it says the tax rate will remain the same. Tax rates inside the district and outside the district are exactly the same. It's just that they're new and we're leveraging them in order to borrow money to support that project. The only time that the tax within the district may go up is if there is a shortfall in debt service in the increment to pay those bonds. If there is a shortfall, it is not the general fund. It will be the property owners in that district will then pay an additional tax that will support the bonds, so the bonds are completely paid for through the district. Here's a graphic that'll kind of describe the flow of funds. At Port Covington, there is already assessment there. There is already property taxes being collected. When the development district is established, those taxes will continue to flow to the general fund uninterrupted. And that's reflected here in the blue bar. As time goes on, base taxes to the general fund. As time goes on, the project is developed, new assessment occurs, and then the revenue associated with that light blue line is that new increment I mentioned that will then be dedicated to the borrowing to support the project. Over time, as the project matures, the debt becomes fixed and that blue line becomes fixed, just like your mortgage. It's a fixed payment. It remains constant throughout. The bottom line is the base taxes we mentioned still continues to the general fund. But if you look at the top, there's a light green line that starts to appear about midway through that development period. I'll talk about that in a minute. As the project continues and to mature, as you see, the baseline taxes still come to the general fund. The center line is then dedicated to the bonds. That's the revenue that is going to repay the bonds that we borrowed to complete the infrastructure for the project. But over time, the city will gather additional taxes above what is required for the debt service. So over time, the general fund will enjoy that light green at the top as well as the blue at the bottom, but that center blue will always be dedicated to the bonds until they're retired. And at the end of the process, when the project is completed, the bonds are paid off. At the end of in this case, it'll be about a 40-year period. At the end, all of the taxes will then come to the city. The TIF district will then fold and not exist anymore, and 100% of the taxes will come to the general fund, and that's reflected in the far right green bars. Oops. TIF proceeds are typically pledged for city-owned public infrastructure. None of the TIF bonds are going to go for any of the private vertical developments such as the hotel, office space, Under Armour. None of that has happened. It's going to be for parks, roads, streets, sewers, and things like that. That will be available to the public and publicly owned. When the bonds are repaid, the TIF revenues revert back to the general fund as part of general tax collections, as I described in the previous slide. Let's talk a little bit about Port Covington. Mr. Cole already went over the sources of funds here, so I'm not going to talk about this a lot. But I will say TIF proceeds of approximately $35 million. That's a lot of money. And the city has a good process, I think, in place to mitigate our risk and ensure that we are protected. And I'm going to describe that for you here in a minute. But the total infrastructure cost here is about $1.4 billion. The total gross proceeds is going to be greater than the net proceeds of $535 million. I believe the bond ordinance asks for $660 million. The reason for that difference is because when you issue the bonds, you have to have reserves established to protect bondholders who purchase those bonds. And there's also capitalized interest. That's also part of that development period that we have to cover for. Those are covered in that bond amount. So in addition, there's a very small amount, about maybe $5 to $8 million are actually costs of issuing those bonds. But the vast majority of that difference is capitalized interest and reserves that are required as part of issuing the bonds. They're sized at greater than 1-to-1 debt service. So for every dollar of debt service, we program 125% of tax increment to cover that. One thing that folks don't really understand is that the projections indicate that the developer will be paying $291 million in special taxes. That will be a direct offset to the city's interest cost. So we have about a $1.4 billion cost on the interest on the bonds and principal. That's going to be directly offset that $291 million. In addition, the developer has also agreed to keep the city whole on the brownfield tax credit that we have to repay back to the state. That's another $34 million. That all totals about $325 million that we'll be getting from the developer on special taxes. The other thing that's important is we're not going to issue all these bonds at once. We're going to phase this out. We're going to do it over about 12 years, and when we expect about 4 phases. So that way we spread out our risk, we ensure that the project is moving along as we had expected, and we only issue when we need to. The but-for test, this is important. The but-for test is why does this project need assistance from the city? Why does it need this TIF? What about it is special? Why are we putting all this money in? And there's 2 ways that we look at this. There's a qualitative, and then there's the quantitative. The qualitative is the macro view. If you drive through the site, I'm not going to repeat what Mr. Cole said, but as you can see, it lacks significant public infrastructure. Anybody that's been through there can see it. So when you see that, you say, okay, well, it looks like TIF subsidy might be needed here, but the question is how much? And then what we do is we look at the quantitative approach, and that's getting into the numbers. That's when we really start to analyze what are they actually doing, what are they trying to construct, what are they borrowing, what is their equity, and how does all that add up, and what does that mean to the developer as far as a return? What we found out without the TIF, because of the large amount of the public infrastructure that needs to be done at that site, that the rate of return to the developer is actually a negative 1.90%. And that tells us that a developer will not try to redevelop that site if they're not going to make any money on it. That's just a fact of the matter. So with a negative 1.9%, we can expect that the development as proposed, as planned, the budget that is in the TIF applications available online probably will not happen with a negative return. So that means we have to provide some sort of TIF assistance if we are going to see that site be developed. And when we take a look at what the proposal is, and we factor that into our analysis, we see that the TIF ups that rate of return. Obviously, we're providing $535 million. You think it's going to have a positive effect. And what it does, it raises up to about a 9.25%. People might think that's a really great return. It is a decent return, but it's well below what a ground-up real estate investment firm would be looking for. How we verify that is we looked at the Price Waterhouse Real Estate Investors Survey, which is a standard publication that is available at cost for real estate investors. And what they do is they take surveys around the country and they determine what the average is. And what they say is between 10 and 20% is what a decent return for a ground-up type development like Port Covington would be required to attract the right investment, the right equity, and the right lending from a private lender. And what we find is the average is about 15%. So let's take the middle point here at 15. You compare that to 9.25 and a negative 1.9%. And that's still below what market would otherwise be. Now, yeah, sorry, Councilwoman. We'll talk about this here real quickly. What this is we've taken the graph, we graphed their pro forma. When we looked at the development period, is about 29 years, and we looked at the cash inflows and the cash outflows that'll be required to sustain this project and get it completed. And what we found out was without the TIF is the red line. With the TIF is the blue line. And what these are cumulative cash flows. So in other words, if you spend $5 in year one, you've spent $5 in year two. At the end of year two, that's $10 that you're out of your pocket. So that's what that's doing. They're starting out with zero with the TIF, and it gets up to a decent amount over there on the right with the TIF with the blue bar. Without the TIF, you can see it's all negative, that the cash flow of this just will not work without some sort of assistance, and it relates back to the negative 1.9%. So also what I want to show here is that even with the TIF, because of the upfront costs associated with redeveloping Port Covington, they've got to acquire the property, they've got to assemble the site, they've got to get the site work done, and then we've got to start working on the infrastructure. There's a lot of upfront cost. So our performer is indicating that they will actually be out of pocket for the first several years. You see the negative blue lines there. Over $100 million we're estimating, cumulative, not yearly, but that's cumulative. And they don't actually start turning positive until about year 19 or 20. So they are getting a return, but that return, you got to remember, is in the back end of this deal as we are projecting. The further back it is, the more risky it is. And as far as without the TIF, it's really hard to even describe. It's just really negative, and it just wouldn't work. So what's happening is they're starting out with zero here on the left side, and they're ending up with a negative $132 million on the right side without any TIF assistance. And that's what our analysis is showing thus far. There we go. Let's talk, okay, we talked about the developer. Let's talk about what's in it for us. Okay, what is the city getting out of this, all right? That's important. All right, let's take a look at it. The project revenues at the tax revenues that the city is going to get about $2.6 billion we're estimating over the life of the bonds. It's 41 years. When you subtract out debt service paid, it's about $1.44 billion. The net increment, so we're expecting to get about a 1.2 after we pay the debt service on these bonds. So that's additional revenues. That's that light green part at the top of that bar chart we were talking about. I talked about the special taxes that they're going to add to that, $291 million, $34 million in reimbursement for brownfield. That's a direct offset to our debt service costs. So when you talk about $1.4 billion in debt service, I guess the net of that is really about a 1.1. The other benefits that we see are personal property, enterprise zone reimbursement from the state. Folks don't realize this, but we get half of that back from the state. We give them the credit, the state pays us 50% back, so that's great for us. Hotel occupancy tax revenues, energy tax revenues, but the big kicker here is personal income tax of the new residents. That's what really drives the other revenue piece. And when you add all that up at the bottom and you subtract out all the additional expenses, and we also include $32 million of city expenses just associated with Port Covington. That's $32 million. That's a lot of money. That's in this analysis. And even with that included, with the debt service, we're still showing about a $1.7 billion positive effect at the end of the day. That's that number at the very bottom. I don't know if you can see it. Like the developer, they're not making a lot of money up front. It's taken them a couple of years. The city's got the same issue. We're not losing anything. We're not negative. We're always positive. That blue line represents the revenues. The red line represents the expenses. We're always a little bit better in the beginning years. It gets as high as maybe $5 to $7 million, which would have been a great thing to have this last budget cycle. So anyway, we're positive, but the big benefit, I want to be upfront with everyone, that the big dollars roll in at the back end when the debt is retired and that full increment then comes to the city. How are we going to mitigate the risk? I told you this is a lot of money. How are we going to manage all this? Well, there's a couple things that we're doing. First is, I said before, we're going to issue the bonds in phases. If the council approves this and it gets signed into law, We're not the next day going to go out and issue $660 million worth of bonds. We're not doing that. What we're going to do is we're going to do it in phases. And the first phase is only $60 million. So by spreading that out, we're spreading out our risk. We're ensuring the project is going to be viable before we put more investment into it. Each phase must also demonstrate that development can support the debt that we're going to issue. So in phase one, we're issuing $61 million. They have got to demonstrate to us that they have enough additional new construction, new assessment to support that $61 million. And this is the third bullet is I think very, very important. The developer must demonstrate firm funding commitments for all of their development, even the horizontal public infrastructure piece that they're funding, as well as the vertical that they're funding. They got to demonstrate to us that they've got the equity lined up, they've got the state funds, the federal funds, and the private lending, if there is any. And those commitments have to be firm. And we are very hard on that. And what that does, it means that when we all jump off together with this first phase, we're all doing it together. All these things will close at the same time. And that way, we know that the funding commitments are in place. And the construction will happen at the same time. As we're doing our public infrastructure, they'll start their vertical part as well, and all of us will be in it at the same time with the commitments in place. So we're not out there. I read a story that they say the city is just going to issue these bonds and hope the development happens. That's absolutely not true. They've got to have all these commitments in place. We don't do it that way, and we never have. The developer must consent to a special tax to cover their debt service, and we talked about that before. That was at $291 million. They're getting a lot of tax credits, which is great. They get brownfields and enterprise zone credit. What that does, it means their property taxes are less than they otherwise would be. That special tax keeps them honest. That means they got to pay that right back to us if there's a deficiency, and we're expecting it to be at $291 million. Due to the size of this funding commitment, the Department of Finance has elected to secure a conduit issuer. Now, what does that mean? What that means is the city is going to use another entity, a state entity, to issue these bonds on our behalf. And what we will do is then pledge the revenues of the district to repayment of those bonds. And what that means is that that entity then owns that debt. It's not the city. We're pledging the revenues, but under that type of structure, it will not be considered on the city's debt profile, and the city won't have to account for that on our financial statements, which is a big positive for us. That's under the current accounting rules. We also, this is not anything new. We anticipated doing this with Westport, but we didn't have to do that because Westport didn't move forward. But we anticipated doing the same structure with Westport. Let's talk about jobs. This is a big part of it. I know we heard some other folks here talk about numbers. Our numbers might be a little lower because we don't just take what they give us. We take a look at it and we analyze it, and sometimes we ratchet it down. Quite often we do. In this case, for construction jobs, we call these temporary employment, but these are the construction impacts. We're looking at direct, if you look at the full-time direct impacts of 14,603 jobs, those are on-site construction jobs over the period of this development. For full-time equivalent wages of about $1.1 billion. That's real money, and that's something that we really need, and that's a very positive. The rest of it are jobs and indirect impacts that are either part-time or jobs off-site, but will be within the city in support of this. And this was all forecasted by MuniCap using an M-plan. It's called IMPLAN forecasting model, where you put in these certain parameters and locations, and it generates this data. So that's a very positive thing. Now, permanent employment on-site and indirect off-site is about 34,000 jobs. Now, what we're talking about direct impacts on-site of 22,603 jobs, those are full-time jobs that will be, we estimate will be produced in Port Covington. Half of that will be, I assume, is the Under Armour, and the rest will be in support of the hotel, office, other retail, and manufacturing. So those are all very positive things. All of them direct, indirect, part-time, full-time, all of that together totals about 34,000 for about $2.3 billion of annual compensation. All very, very positive numbers. And I think with that, I'm done. So, thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Is Mooney Court Cap going to come up or no? Okay, they don't have a testimony at this moment. So we will now have the council, beginning with Council President Young, ask questions or state concerns.
Thank you, Chairman Stokes. This is for finance. As this is the largest TIF in Baltimore City, representing a huge project area, I have received questions about how city services will be funded over the lifetime of the TIF. Can you describe the TIF's impact on general fund revenues that will pay for city services within the development district?
As part of the presentation, I think we mentioned that we're allocating at full build-out, $33.2 million in city services. And what that means is that when we do the analysis on the financial impacts of this project, we have included $33.2 million in that analysis. So when we check the cash flows in each year, they're all positive, and they show that it includes that operating cost. So what we're showing is that this project is generating enough secondary revenue and property tax revenue to accommodate what we believe will be the operating impacts of this project, to include fire, police, schools, and things like that.
So it wouldn't have no impact on the rest of the city?
That's right. It'll be additional revenue associated with the employment, with the property taxes, and the rest.
Okay. I guess this will be for BDC. Has the profit sharing agreement been drafted?
Mr. Chairman, we are in active negotiations with Sagamore and believe that we have a draft. We can't finalize it until after the council action is done, but we will have an agreement in principle and in writing by your next work session.
Okay, and to be given to the council
Yes, sir.
via the taxation
Yes, sir.
committee?
Yes, sir.
Okay. The inclusionary housing in Port Covington. Sagamore is exempt from providing inclusionary housing within Port Covington. If the project does not have specific performance requirement to create affordable housing unit, describe in detail how to measure whether the project is inclusive. I guess that would be for housing.
Mr. President, we have the Housing Commissioner here. He's going to make his way up right now.
Please, let's be respectful. We need to get an answer. So the chair already asked that when someone else is speaking, please, be a little quiet so we can hear. But when you speak, we're going to be quiet.
Good evening, everyone. Let me just go through a couple of the basics here. The inclusionary housing ordinance says that if there's a major public subsidy, the project has to be reviewed and determine whether or not it is subject to the inclusionary housing requirement, which is 20% of the units in a broad band of income, so that it's up to 100% of area median income. And I think a lot of people don't know that or don't realize that. So basically, the top 20% is at 100% of area median income. The next 20% is at 80% area median income. And then the balance, the 55%, is below 60% and below. There's an analysis that was done, and it determined that it would. There's also another requirement in the ordinance that says if there is to be affordable housing under this ordinance, the developer must be made whole. And the calculation that was made is that it would be $184 million and that would be based on only about 5,300 units. So if you had 7,500 units, it would be an even higher number. The city does not have, we have about less than $400,000 in the inclusionary housing fund at this point available. So what we did, what we were required to do under the ordinance is to waive the requirement because the city could not meet that, making the developer whole. Well, that's what the law says. That's what the law says, and I have to, we have to carry out the law. However, we immediately commenced negotiations with the developer, and there is a firm commitment to build 10% of the units, and in each case they'd have to apply for low-income housing tax credits, which would set the income limits at 60% of area median income and below. So basically the difference between the inclusionary housing ordinance and what we have is 1%, okay? The ordinance would require that 11% of the units be affordable at 60% of area median income or below. What we have in the agreement is that 10% of the units would be affordable at 60% of area median and below. And we've also committed to providing vouchers that would be tied to the projects to make them affordable down to zero income. So there'd be a portion of that affordable housing that will be affordable all the way down to zero income. So that's what the agreement calls for. And I know there was some discussion about goals, and I can say, and I've spoken to the developers, the intent of the agreement, and I don't have any problem with clarifying that, and I've spoken with the developers since it was raised today, I think even in the editorial. The intent is that is a firm commitment. It is not merely a goal, that the 10% of the units are to be tax credit units at or below 60% area median income. And that is the commitment, and also with the Housing Authority providing vouchers to ensure that a significant number of those units are affordable way below 30% area median income.
Paul, we like to have a copy of that agreement given to the Taxation Committee.
Sure.
So that we all can see it.
Sure. And again, I want to be clear. I've had discussions as recently as a couple of days ago with the developers, and we all agreed that the intent is that is a commitment, not a goal.
Okay. Well, we getting as council members, we're getting calls and we're getting stopped in the street about 2 Baltimores, and we want to make sure that this project represents all of Baltimore. So it's important that
I agree. I agree 100%. I think it's a terrific opportunity for us to provide, to produce high-quality housing at affordable prices for people at or below 60% of area median income, as I said, all the way down to zero income.
Okay, because that's what we're getting beat up on. Thank you, Mr. Chair. We're going to have other questions because I have a list of them.
That's it for that?
Thank you. Councilman Henry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have one question. It's about affordable housing, but I don't think it's a question for the commissioner. I think it's a question either for Sagamore or for BDC. I don't think it's. I don't think this is for you. The question is sort of following up on how the affordable housing played out, how the lack of participation in the inclusionary housing program played out. Why was there not a request to use TIF funds to provide the needed subsidy to provide the affordable units?
So your question is, why didn't we use TIF funds to?
Very, very specifically, and the answer, the first answer could be that Sagamore did ask, and for some reason we said no. But why was there not a? So that's why I'm saying I think this question might first be for Sagamore. Why didn't you ask to use TIF funds to subsidize the affordable housing?
When we began planning this project, sorry, better?
Yeah.
When we began planning this project, we looked strictly at the parks and the public realm and the infrastructure necessary to support it. I know that there is the city's law. We did not know exactly as we moved into the planning process how many residential units we would have. We've not set, specific buildings in place at this point or specific unit levels at this point. And so I think it was just a natural maturation in the process. I know that as we had preliminary discussions with not just council members, but administration and agency folks, everybody said, there is a law in place. And we said, we will abide by the law, absolutely, without question.
Well, so I'll admit that we do not have a very good inclusionary housing law, and that's why we're going to be fixing it.
Yeah.
But what the law does say right now is if you're getting any kind of major public subsidy, which you were going to be asking for, it says you will have to provide 20% of the units of any residential affordable, and the law does lay out at which levels. Now, even if you didn't pre-calculate the number that the housing department did eventually have to come up
I see
with,
what you're asking.
even if you didn't pre-calculate that exact number at that exact time, when you were negotiating with the BDC over what you were going to need TIF funds for, did you ever ask, well, let's try, maybe 184 might be,
Right.
hard to
Yep.
a hard reach, but could we put in 90 million of that, and we'll try for the low-income housing tax credits to make up the difference?
Pausing.
Technically, you should applaud the answer, but we'll see. Okay.
Right.
Okay.
So at the time that we were forming and writing our TIF application, we were doing the estimates for the park and the infrastructure. We were simultaneously negotiating with the administration to enter into the housing agreement that the commissioner just discussed with you.
Okay. I'm sorry. I had.
Sorry.
So I'm not. So
When we were formulating the TIF application, the only thing I can do is tell you actually how it happened. When we were working on the TIF application, we were negotiating with the administration the agreement with the housing department and the city that we eventually entered into. And so that's why we put the mechanisms in place at that point.
So then maybe this is a chronology question. Did the waiver from the housing department come before or after you concluded the size of the TIF request?
You know what? I actually don't know.
Guys.
Yeah.
It was all part of the same negotiation.
Guys, please, hey.
Councilman, it was all part of the same negotiation. The applicant, Sagamore, came to the city with a request for infrastructure support to do the horizontal development for this project. In it, obviously, an analysis is done. MuniCap gets involved. In the process, obviously, inclusionary housing is one of the issues that has to be addressed because of the law.
Right.
We engaged, through the mayor's office, Colin Tarbert, engaged the housing commissioner to review the application and understand what was the best approach. The MOU was the solution that came out of that. To answer your specific question, I'm not sure I can answer it today. I can get you an answer by the time we meet next week about the use of TIF, but I do know that one of the issues is related to the cost of funds in building affordable units. And I think, the commissioner can, we can get back to you next week about that specific question.
Because here, and I'm sorry to take up the time, Mr. Chair, this is going to be the only question, but I'm going to ask all of it. What I'm trying to get into is, if I understand the current commitment towards affordable inclusive housing from the part of Sagamore, the commitment is to use low-income housing tax credits, if you get them, to subsidize the cost of doing the affordable units. If there is a commitment from Sagamore to put some amount of their own cash into making sure that there are affordable units, if that's part of the calculation, then I would appreciate that number being shared with us.
Okay.
Because I'm willing to buy into the concept that TIF funds as spent on what they're agreed to be spent on is taxes that Sagamore will eventually pay being financed. I'm willing to kind of buy into that idea that those are monies that you will pay to the city that's making those things happen. What I'm curious about, though, is if no other money of yours is going into the affordable housing, then I think we should consider looking very specifically at the list of things that the TIF money is being used for, and then hold on. Okay, let me get through. Listen, more applause, the longer till you guys get to talk. Okay, there we go. All right. We've got $56 million for West Shoreline Park, $26 million for the archaeological pier and demolition, $21 million for the other pier, and then there are a number of amenities in this project, which I will be the first to admit will make that part of the city look gorgeous, and I would love for all of the city's parks and green space to be as wonderful. But if it came down to it and we had to choose between having a really gorgeous park and housing a couple hundred families, then I think that should be a conversation. And if the plan is that there is money that Sagamore is putting into affordable housing that we're not aware of, then please, I would look forward to having that information by the next workshop.
Councilman, I'm going to defer to Mr.
Oh,
Laria, who's been
okay.
trying to get to the mic there.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, may I? Thanks. John Laria with Ballard Spar. We're counsel to Sagamore. I just wanted to offer a few facts and a few technical matters. Councilman Henry, the developer is responsible for the initial housing units at its own expense, in the sense that they either have to be provided or they have to pay a fee in lieu in cash. So it's not as though the developer has no obligation to make a contribution. In addition to that, the developer has an obligation which has never been made before by a developer under these scenarios to apply for low-income housing tax credits, which, as you know, requires that the units be at 60% or below. So in fact, there is a commitment of developer money. It's not simply that we're going to apply for tax credits, and if it happens with somebody else's money, et cetera. And so that's the first thing. The second thing is, I just remember the TIF is as currently constituted for 100% public infrastructure. And I think when we made the application, we were focused on the fact that it made sense to try and keep that as pure as possible and have 100% publicly owned infrastructure. It is very unusual, in fact, for TIF proceeds to be allowed for inclusionary housing. It's not for housing at all. The city happens to have is in the minority, really, you can do it in the city. I don't know that TIFs have ever been used in the city for affordable housing, but of course the law does provide it. I think we were focused on infrastructure, not on what would end up being privately owned affordable housing. So it was just a technical sort of like choice about how we were thinking about the TIF as an infrastructure TIF and not a TIF that was going to be for affordable housing. The technical issues are these. The TIF proceeds can only be used within the TIF district, and that means that you would have to provide housing at Port Covington. There's certainly, as I just said, under the MOU, we fully intend to provide it at Port Covington in pursuant to those terms. But the issue is that using additional TIF proceeds to fund those units at Port Covington is a fairly expensive proposition. And a decision has to be made about whether that is the best and most efficient use of the resources under the TIF. That's a policy decision. It's a decision that can be discussed. I'm simply explaining to you, try to answer your question about how we got from there to here. It was not a decision to exclude it. It was just, as Caroline Paff said, sort of a natural evolution of what was really viewed as an infrastructure TIF. So, and we'd be happy to follow up and explain that further or give you any more details.
Okay, so before I flip it back to Councilman Henry, I do want to ask, so philosophically, is it Sagamore's intention to have an inclusive community? We've all seen the wonderful ads, "We will build it," and we all seen little black kids, so I guess, who are going to be a part of that. And yes, I am throwing out that. But are you philosophically saying you're going to exclude low and moderate income folk?
For the record, of course not. Of course not. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to answer your. It's a critically important question. It's come up in all the public hearings. I don't know how anybody can conclude from any of the presentations, any of the materials, any of the MOUs, that there's any intent to create any sort of segregated white gated enclave, which is the phrase that's been thrown around. We have commitments to affordable housing in the MOUs. We've described what they are. They're unprecedented. As I said at the Planning Commission, and Councilman Henry said this just a few moments ago, the city's inclusionary housing law needs work. We agreed at the Planning Commission and privately or separately with Housing that we would work with them. We agreed with the Council President that we would work with him to do what we could do to change and enhance that law. But these claims that somehow the law wasn't followed or that there's some malintent here are just not fair to Sagamore. Sagamore has made a commitment, and there is absolutely no intention whatsoever to exclude anybody from participating in any aspect of Port Covington.
Okay, so you will then. Okay, so we have 130 people signed up to speak. If we have no applause, we can get through them. If we continue, we won't. So will you, Sagamore, be willing to change or even throw away the waiver and make a firm commitment of affordable and low-income housing on this 250 acres, approximately 41 city blocks?
Well, I would ask, you can't laugh, I haven't said anything yet.
I'm saying it again?
No, I said they can't laugh because I haven't said anything yet. First of all, Sagamore's principles probably should answer the question, but let me say, we are already committed to that under the current agreement. We do not think that the economics of the project permit the provision of additional affordable housing at the developer's expense as the TIF and as the pro formas are currently constituted. If we can find another way to do it, if the city had made funds available under the Inclusionary Housing Fund, if the Inclusionary Housing Fund, instead of having $400,000 had $500 million or $50 million, and that money were available, we would be glad to put it to work at Port Covington. Our intent is to have a mixed income, diverse community. It's a matter of economics. We have already made a commitment that exceeds the law because the law essentially has no effect, as you've heard. It exceeds what anybody else has ever done, and we think it is a fair and reasonable agreement regarding inclusionary housing. We are certainly open to discussions with you, Mr. Chairman, with Chairman Henry of the Housing Committee, with the President, with anybody else about ways to enhance that commitment. It's an economic dilemma. It is not a matter of principle. It is not a matter of intent. It's not a matter of anything that relates to Sagamore and its ethos, as a business. It's a problem of providing affordable housing, especially at the 60% level, which we want to do which is very expensive to do and difficult to do with the economics of the project as they're currently constituted. Will we talk about it? Absolutely.
We're going to continue the conversation. I'm going to move
Yes, sir.
on, but we are talking about starting salaries for police and fire. We're talking about school teachers. We're talking about office workers. We're talking about the moderate income citizens who, by the way, will be contributing to the $1 billion of subsidy that we will be giving to them. I'm not picking a fight, honestly. I know I often come off that way, Mr. Laria. Having said that, this is something that is really tight among the members of the council here to make sure that the community is not an exclusive community, that it doesn't just consist of. It cannot do that. And this will be something that we will push to the limit with the group. This is the one item. There are 3 or 4, but this one is strong. Thank you.
And I'll just say again, we are absolutely committed to the same goal. But affordable housing is nonetheless a financial enterprise that where the numbers have to work. And if we can make the numbers work, we certainly want to do everything we can to have affordable housing at all levels.
I
at Fort
understand.
Covington.
You're making an economic decision, as you should. And I am talking about a philosophical decision. And I understand it. I'm not fighting the differences. I got it. I just have to say that, of course, you can subdevelop. In other words, there are 4, 5, 10 developers in the city of Baltimore who do affordable housing all the time and very happy with the profits that they make in terms of that. There are folk in this town who develop affordable housing on the regular, as we say in the neighborhood. And so they could be others that you could have this conversation with.
Mr. Chairman, you say philosophical and economic. There is a philosophical commitment, but you can't fulfill the philosophical commitment unless it economically works. So we'll work on that together.
Okay, I won't do back and forth. Thank you so much. Thanks, John. Councilwoman Holton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good evening, everyone. Mr. Kraus, I have 2 questions directed towards risk mitigation. You mentioned that $61 million in phase 1 is the first set of bonds, but what's the preliminary plan for the number of bond issuance phases and amounts over what time period? We don't have that information, and that would be helpful. And if you don't have it now.
Yeah, I think the second phase is in the $200 million range. Within the TIF application, under the bonds forecasting pro forma, there is a list of the series, and I'll provide that to you. But it is spaced out. We're going to be about $260, $270 million through the first 2 phases, and then the rest of it, I think, is spread out over the last 2.
So the detail of that would be helpful, because out of the $61 million, that leaves $474 million. And I may have overlooked it. I know there's a lot of information here. So to that end, what is the plan for risk mitigation in the event of another major market downturn like we had in 2008? And I know that Treasury is very conservative in their estimates, and it'd be helpful to know what's the plan. You know, this is not the first time that there was a TIF deal done on Port Covington site, and because of the 2008 market downturn, it didn't happen.
All right. Well, what happened with the previous example at Westport was that the developer at that time was unable to get all those funding commitments I mentioned. I said before we step off together, they've got to demonstrate they got everything in place. And he wasn't able to do that, so that's why Westport never occurred. That will be the same situation here. I think that is a big risk mitigator, is that they've got to have all their funding in place. And once that is in place, that is a commitment, and then we'll all step off together. If a recession should hit again after the project is in place, we have that special tax that we will impose upon them. And the developer is required to pay that if there is a deficiency. So those are two things that I think that will address your issue.
Okay, so then my next question, what is the plan, and this isn't you, Steve, what is the plan for inclusion of minority and women business enterprises, especially small local businesses that provide professional services? We're always able to meet, in most cases, those for contracting, but I'm concerned about those MWBEs, particularly the small local ones that provide professional services.
And Councilwoman Holton, as a former partner at a law firm that had to get business on a professional service, I too, I understand the issue. What I would say is that a couple of things that we have in place. One, we are intaking and having professional service providers sign up through the same portal that contractors are providing. The second piece is that all of those individuals will be contacted and interviewed. On September 12th, we are hosting our first of a series of sessions geared toward professional service MBEs and WBE professional service providers to apprise them of what opportunities are available, how will the process go for them getting access to those opportunities, and then also addressing capacity issues. So if individuals or businesses are not at the first round able to access those opportunities, let's be transparent and let those businesses know what can you do to achieve and to get the next contract or round of contracts that are available. Everything from florists to lawyers to everything in between. September 12th.
And then the other question I have has to do with the MOUs. MOUs are nice on paper, but my question is, how binding are they in terms of the inclusionary housing, the MWB and BE, and particularly local hiring, since the funding through MOIT is for 5 years, and that is laudable. Don't get me wrong, but 5 years on a project that's going to go on for 5 times that amount of time, how binding are they beyond what's written on this paper? We're in an administration that will be gone, and what makes these agreements stand?
Councilwoman, pardon
Mr.
me.
Laria? Yeah.
All I can say is they're binding legal agreements with the city. They were passed by the Board of Estimates. They were signed by Sagamore, and Sagamore certainly has no intent and is in no position to breach them. I mean, it's just, I can't imagine how a developer, which is going to have a decades-long bilateral, multilateral relationship with the city and everybody else involved, could possibly walk away from any of those agreements and expect not to suffer all sorts of intended and unintended consequences. So, they're binding agreements with the city. We take them seriously, and we'll say on the record, we're bound by them, period, end of story.
But would you provide a copy of those agreements to the committee?
Of course.
Since they've been signed? I mean, I've not seen them.
Absolutely.
And the one question I have, so in terms of the local hiring, and it's laudable that you're funding that effort through MOIT, but it's for 5 years at 51%, and 5 years is the tip of the iceberg for what this project is going to do. And so what are the assurances that we have that beyond 5 years we know that there's going to continue to be monitoring in terms of 51% of local hiring of new jobs as new jobs are rolling out online?
Well, we're happy to talk with you, Councilwoman, and your colleagues about ways to provide that assurance. There's you can't enter into an agreement forever, so there's a term, and that's the commitment that was made.
But we have we have a financial commitment on these binds for 41 years.
Absolutely.
And so I would just say, if we're making a commitment to local hiring at 51%, because if you look around the state in terms of unemployment and underemployment, and the underemployment is really important here. And if we're going to make a commitment of hiring 51% locally in new positions, there needs to be a plan in place to talk about capacity, and workforce development and re-entry. These are real hard issues in Baltimore City, and 5 years is not enough time to see that we're going to accomplish that, to get closer to... to get closer to mirroring what the state numbers are, because if you look at Maryland as a state nationally, it looks like we have full employment and that our unemployment is low. But if you look jurisdiction by jurisdiction, Baltimore City is woefully out of sync with the rest of the state.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Jason, I'm sorry, John, Mr. Laria, are you good? I was going to ask Mr. Perkins Cohen to speak to
Mr.
it.
Chairman, while you're doing that, there is an important part here about what Sagamore has agreed to do with the comptroller that I think the committee needs to be aware of.
Okay, thank you.
Early on in the process, we did meet with... Early on in the process, we did meet with the comptroller, and her request to us was that we fund an auditor, a level 3 city auditor, who would be specifically charged with auditing our agreements on a monthly basis, generating reports that the council or the Board of Estimates or anyone else may want to view. I think that as a matter of commitment and compliance, but also as a matter of transparency, because I know that there is a lot of distrust. And so we want to, comply fully. And I think I tune in on this. It's my team that will actually be doing the compliance. So we're glad to do it. We're glad to have, the city auditor doing that, and somebody who is impartial and not in our office.
Mr. Chairman, let me offer a more precise, a more accurate, and hopefully conclusive answer to your question. And Councilwoman, actually, I think I was mistaken. I misunderstood, I think, your question. There is a provision, and I'll quote from it in the MOU. It says, the term is 5 years from the date shown and shall automatically renew for an additional 5 years unless earlier terminated by the written agreement of both the city and the developer. So that language is in there. It's basically like on the very last page before the paragraph 7 on page 5.
Yeah.
So I should have given you that answer. We don't think of this as a 5-year agreement. So actually, I was having a hard time contextualizing your question. But the agreement very specifically provides that, and I think that's just the way the form is written. I'm not entirely sure why it has a 5-year term, essentially renewable forever, until both sides decide that it's not going to be renewed. So actually, I think that is a good and solid answer to your question, and it's frankly better than my earlier one. I apologize.
Thank you.
I don't see where it's renewable in my briefing book on local hiring, so maybe that's a later version than what I have. So it would be helpful to have that in writing to know that it will continue on or have the potential to, and I will rely on the prudence of my colleagues going forward to make sure we do continue that piece.
Absolutely. I'm looking at the MOU that came with the Board of Estimates memo.
Oh, well, there we go. We don't have the MOU. So that would be helpful for us to have a copy.
Matter of
the
public
MOU.
record, and in any event, you are certainly entitled to it, and we'll get it to you promptly.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Councilwoman, you should have the MOU in your package, but we'll work through that. Mr. Perkins Cohen, you decide not to?
That was really the point I was going to make.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you so much. I'm going to go to, and maybe we can knock out a couple of questions each, if you would. Colleagues, thank you for your patience also. Councilman Costello, Scott, and Spector in that order, please. The two are gone.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe this question is probably for finance and piggybacks off of Councilwoman Holton's question regarding risk management. So I think most likely Mr. Kraus. Could you walk through just the number of TIF districts that we have in the city that have debt associated with them? Just total number.
Microphone, please. Do we have one? Can you took?
The city has about 8 TIF districts that have debt associated with them, and I believe that totals about, I think we're close to closing one now, or we closed one today? Tomorrow. That would put us about $170 million.
Mr. Costello, did he answer you? Did he answer you? Yeah, sure.
And how many of those TIF districts have paid a special tax?
I think about 3 of them have paid special tax, and that was imposed because they didn't have enough tax increment to cover the debt service. So the city issued a supplemental tax bill. They paid it. We received it. It was applied towards the debt service, and the general fund was not tapped at all for that. So it worked as advertised.
So there's never been a default on a TIF debt?
No, there's never been a default on TIF debt. That is correct. On the city's TIF debt. That is correct.
And general fund dollars have never been used to pay a TIF debt?
That's correct. The TIF increment revenue, special taxes, and the increment, as I described in the slideshow, is all that has been used to pay debt service on the city's TIF bonds. So no, other general fund revenues have not been used.
So just from a risk management perspective, can you explain why that is?
It's that way because we have those 2 things that I mentioned. One is the special tax itself. If there is a deficiency, these guys over here pick up the tab. We bill them. If they don't pay it, they go into tax sale. So there's a very big incentive for them to pay that bill. The second is that we ensure that the increment is there before we do the financing. We ensure all the commitments are in place, and we ensure through our consultant, these 2 fine people behind me, help us to ensure that the assessment will be there to cover the debt.
Thank you, Mr. Kraus. The second question has to do with school funding from the state. This issue's come up again and again, and my understanding is as a result of the city's growth and wealth, some of our state funding has been cut, and something that we're obviously all concerned about, specifically with regard to the foundation grant. Can you talk about how this will impact state funding and what can be done to mitigate that risk?
Sure, thank you. So one of the issues that came up at the BDC board and then was repeated again at the Board of Finance, and I can let Mr. Kraus discuss what they said, was that this project can have no material impact on school funding. And as we know, under the current formula, TIFs, well, mainly pilots, but TIFs could have an adverse effect on our school funding formula the way it is structured presently. Delegate McIntosh went to Annapolis this last session. She has provided a 3-year fix to the school funding issue to restore those funds so that we don't have the negative impact. The goal is that by the end of that 3-year period to have a permanent fix so that we are not punished as a jurisdiction for trying to improve through development. So that's the short-term answer is there's a 3-year fix in place. The long-term answer is if something were to fail, the Board of Finance very clearly would have serious reservations, and Steve, you might want to talk about this, about being able to issue bonds if it's going to have a material effect on the general fund because we have to make up the difference in school aid. So I think the goal is to ensure that we have a permanent fix in Annapolis to the school aid question.
We've been very clear from the very beginning that the general fund is not going to pick up the tab for this development. They understand that. We understand that. They've agreed that this project will not adversely affect the city's general fund in any way. So, as I described before, the total benefits of this is about $1.7 billion. The impact on school aid, we did an assessment. We hope, again, that the state will take corrective action and hold us harmless. But if they don't, the impact is on the foundation grant piece that includes assessed value as part of their contribution to us. As our assessed value goes up, they say, oh, we don't need as much money, so we're going to cut you. The impact of that is about $315 million over the 41-year period. That's a lot of money. But if you put that towards that 1.7, we're down to 1.4 billion. It's still a good deal for the city. But what we've got to do is we've got to make sure that what that does is that puts added stress on our cash flow. We've got to make sure that every year that we have this TIF in place, that we do an analysis to determine whether or not we might have a little bit of a negative in those early years where it's tight. Remember the graph we showed you, the first 10, 20 years are a little tight. If we see a deficit there, we're going to have to make some sort of an adjustment. Either the interest rate on the TIF debt is going to be lower, we're going to shift the debt back a little bit, or they're going to have to make some accommodation to the city, and that's our agreements.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Kraus. I definitely appreciate the fact that there's flexibility on the city and on Sagamore's side to help mitigate that risk, and obviously makes me feel very comfortable. Thank you. Mr. Chairman.
Councilwoman Spector.
Mr. Chairman, I think this question is for Sagamore. We heard about the SB 6 agreement with the South Baltimore communities. Can you elaborate on the engagement process? The SB 6?
Yes, Councilwoman Spector. Over the course of about 6 months, we engaged with those South Baltimore communities. Initially, our engagement was with each community separately. Very shortly after we began our engagement, those 6 communities formed a coalition which entered into, and I wouldn't call it negotiations, but rather dialogues with Sagamore Development. Again, they were represented by the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, had at the table also the Maryland Legal Aid Bureau and the Enterprise Community Partners. We engaged in robust discussions, dozens of meetings, and came to an agreement, really rather than an agreement regarding a partnership over the course of the development, the 30 years. Would you like for me to break down the periods? Okay. So the initial commitment is that for as soon as TIF approval is granted, as the legislation passes, $1 million would be issued to help this coalition and Sagamore create a new entity which would address the needs that were identified for the SB 6 communities throughout this engagement process. Then over the course of the next 5 years, $4 million would be issued for a total of, over the first 10 years of the project, $20 million going to the SB 6 communities. We then inserted a long-term funding mechanism so that the South Baltimore 6 communities could share in the growth and the prosperity of the development, which would result in $19 million that would come from 2 different sources. One, from a 25-cent surcharge that would be added to every square foot of commercial space rented in the property, as well as 10% of all the transfers that would happen within the development. The SB 6 communities would receive 66 1/3% of that amount of the funding, which amounts to $19 million. We view this as more of a floor than a ceiling, that $39 million over the course of the 30 years. More importantly, that agreement also had 2 components which I think are quite significant beyond the funding. The SB 6 communities and Sagamore have formed a partnership where Sagamore will, 1, provide technical assistance, which we have not quantified, but could be in upwards of millions of dollars, to help advance issues within their local communities that they have not been able to get traction on for decades. The second portion is that Sagamore would be an advocate with those 6 South Baltimore communities, helping them to maneuver and get things advanced within their communities that they have never been able to advance before. And so it's a huge partnership between the South Baltimore 6 communities. I will defer to them to talk about the details of the discussions, the many late nights and weekends that we spent working on this agreement and this partnership.
Thank you. Councilman Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just some follow-up questions to my colleague, Councilwoman Holton, who spoke about local hiring and also about workforce development. So this question, I guess, would be to Sagamore, and specifically around the creative class, and if we can enter into some agreement where that requires and fosters more and prepares more city residents to become a part of the creative class. We know that African Americans only make up about 8% of that creative class.
Councilman Scott, just to your point, we have worked quite diligently on a workforce development plan, which will be rolled out in very short order. Let me just talk to you a little bit about two components of that and some work that we've done around that. On June 13th of this year, one, we have a workforce development expert who's here today that has been advising us on the new jobs that will be created, when those jobs will roll out, what sort of jobs and what sort of the educational level for those jobs. The second component is that we have done diligently and more hours than you would ever imagine working with local workforce training providers to understand the complexities of what do they face when training up a workforce, what are the opportunities. Everyone, individuals from the city school system, trade schools, to workforce development providers, not just on the construction front, but also on those professional services side. And so a lot of thought and input and work is being done and has been ongoing, and a lot of work has been done on the community side to understand what are our existing assets with regard to workforce development and how can we enhance and build capacity within those organizations.
Thank you. And just really quickly, Mr. Chair, just a second follow-up. And also, I know that the councilwoman spoke about it a little bit, but also something similar as far as mentorship for these minority women businesses, because we know of the great work and the great businesses that exist under the Sagamore Under Armour flag, and we know that a lot of our local businesses could benefit from mentorship from them to help them expand and create and have a greater impact on our city.
Thanks.
Councilwoman Clark.
Can I ask two questions?
You go.
Okay. This is a generic question, and maybe I'm jumping ahead, but it's the one that keeps haunting me. And the question's going to be the manner in which obligations are agreed to and documented in a secure way, so that they endure and are honored down through the years, given that people may be agreeing to things now that are not going to be in their same positions, or planets maybe, in several years out. And so obviously we need either amendments to legislation or or commitments running with titles, something permanent that is clearly spelled out. I think SB 6 sounds to me like an agreement that has been agreed to, and there are specifics in it. And I'm talking now about the workforce development, the arrangement of the construction programs and apprenticeship training, career paths, etc. And I'm also, of course, talking about the housing agreements that finally get made, because I believe there are a lot of conversations and perhaps commitments going around, but are they carved in some kind of stone yet? And other things that so many people have met together, as you say, for untold hours, and now we have reached the point where we have to come to closure with agreements, with commitments, and then we have to make sure that the manner in which they are recorded are permanent and lawful and enduring. So where are we with that, and what are the ideas about how to document and for the down through the years, what commitments are. No, I'm not talking about SB6. They've done their thing, and that sounds great. I'm talking about everything else and how that happens. Oh.
Councilwoman, you may have briefly missed this one when we talked about the MOUs, but there are 3 existing MOUs that have already gone to the Board of Estimates. Those MOUs are considered binding legal documents that have been executed by the developer and by the city. I believe that the law department would argue that they are legally binding documents, and I see them all shaking their head there in the second row. So that's the first piece. The second piece is keep in mind that numbers of pieces of this project have to go back before the Board of Estimates regularly. The development agreements, the Board of Finance has to approve every additional tranche if approved by the council. If they're not keeping up their end of the bargain, either the Board of Estimates or the Board of Finance can step in and stop all action at that point until they are in compliance. I mean, there are mechanisms that are coming still because they have to continue to come back to the city for permits, for development agreements, for lots of other services. So I think at the end of the day, the city does hold a very heavy hammer on enforcement when it comes to these MOUs. The profit sharing is a contract. We have never had a development project that has not lived up to its obligations. So when that is finally agreed to and executed, it will be a contract between the developer and the city.
I'm going to respond. So you need to stay if you could. And yeah, right. Just like being back together on the city council.
Let me go to the next piece. Wait, do Jack, and then.
I went to the Board of Estimates.
Would you hold it for the next round?
The morning. I'm sorry. Let me just finish my. I went to the Board of Estimates the morning that I heard the night before that there were going to be MOUs about a project that is ultimately is a legislative process. And the president who's here tonight, of course, will remember that I very specifically, a couple times, asked the city solicitor if indeed these MOUs were being presented as not binding and not capable of affecting anything the legislative process might do. And I asked him, and he did, to confirm to me that those MOUs were not binding and did not stop a more permanent process from occurring in terms of documentation and of specifics. So that was all I asked that day. I didn't ask about the specifics, and I didn't get into the issues because it didn't matter, because they were coming to the city council. And so the other thing I'd like to say, and this is definitely no reflection on individuals. We have gone through the Board of Estimates process. We have gone through finance, the Board of Finance. We have, out of that, except for SB6, and I guess profit sharing is going to be a contract, no documentation of specific commitments between, about lots of good ideas, workforce, etc. I'm not even sure that we have anything in a binding contract about housing beyond the MOU at the Board of Estimates. So basically, all I'm saying is, let me say this, is Sagamore willing to enter into a more objective, enduring, and specific agreement about this universe of issues that is swarming around and that they know full well because they have gone out to meet with people and hear things.
We're going to ask our law department
Sure.
as well as Sagamore.
I think there's been a little bit of confusion. The agreements are legally binding on Sagamore. The city solicitor was asked if that was all the city could get, and the answer is no. The city may also legislate. So to the extent that you're asking about binding, the city is not stuck where it is currently negotiated. It may do more. Sagamore is legally bound by the agreements.
Ms. Rulli, I just need to say, and then I'm going to have to hand over my microphone. I just need to say this. That's not what I said. And you weren't, I don't know if you were there, but I know the city solicitor will remember, and that the minutes should reflect the specificity of my question, which was basically, can we undo these and do them differently? Yes. I mean, I didn't say those words, but basically that's what I was saying. And maybe, I don't, but if they are binding on Sagamore,
right,
basically they're awfully vague. So basically, what do they really amount to except goals and the like? So I'm not, everybody acts for good intentions. Everybody's good. Nobody's trying to do an evil thing. But we have to take the long view of a 40-year project where no one's going to be around to talk about what it really meant and to make things be enforced as this thing goes down into its later years. So, no, that's not what I said and asked at the Board of Estimates. And I'll just go back to the minutes.
All I can tell you is the agreements are legally binding on Sagamore. The entity of the city will survive long after 40 years, and they have the right to enforce the terms of the agreement. That does not mean that the city can't do more, enter into more agreements, do things legislatively. We are not stuck, was my understanding of the city solicitor's response.
Councilman President Young.
Mr. Chair, I just have one question, and I guess it's for Sagamore. It died.
Testing.
Thank you. Can you hear me now? I want to know, have Sagamore enter into any agreements with the unions, and where do the unions stand in this development? Because that's important.
Thank you. So we entered into discussions with a number of the trades. We entered into discussions with a number of the trades as well as some of the other unions under the AFL-CIO. We have continuing discussions. We have one deal that has been reached at this point, but we're working on others. And we'll continue to. Look, it's a long project. Yes.
What's the deal?
I'm sorry. Well, okay. I think people need to stop asking questions. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So we're going to move to the public testimony, except that Comptroller Joan Pratt has asked to give testimony. In her stead is Walter Horton, who's coming on behalf of Comptroller Joan Pratt to give testimony this evening. Mr. Horton.
Thank you for this opportunity to come before this board to give comments on this lovely project. First and foremost, I know to a number of people's concern is about the affordable housing plan and the MOU. The MOU, as it was structured, indicated that the developer would take all reasonable efforts to complete a goal of 10% of affordable housing. The comptroller feels and testified at the Board of Estimates that the goal need to be changed to a requirement.
All right, thank you.
Okay? Earlier we talked about how to do affordable housing. I believe Steve Kraus showed a chart that illustrated the return on investment, and that chart showed various colors that showed excess cash flow that would come to the general fund, somewhat late in the project, but better late than never. The question and the concern is, can those resources be used to go towards the affordable housing program? We also talked about, and I heard conversations about the but-for analysis, and at the Board of Estimates as well, the comptroller testified on a different project, Harbor Point, regarding the cap rate. Harbor Point's cap rate was initially established on the onset of the legislation. When they came back for a second round or the second tranche, they used the cap rate that was approved on the onset of the legislation, which was 3 years prior to the second request. The comptroller and the Department of Finance agreed that on all future tranches that they would use the current applicable cap rate for the most recent quarter. So we want to go on record that the cap rate in the city needs to clarify and develop a clear, concise policy as to how and what you do when you come for the second tranche as it relates to cap rates. This is critically important because it will set the barometer as to whether or not that TIF amount of money is really needed. We all will probably agree the TIF is needed, but will the same amount of money be needed for each one of these tranches? Also, the comptroller testified at the Board of Estimates in regards to the audit, and I believe Sagamore mentioned the audit finding, where the auditor will be able to review the whole program as it relates to employment, minority participation, and hiring goals. The comptroller also spoke about the youth program, the youth component program, which should run for the entire length of our investment in this project. Some of my concerns you may have already addressed, and I don't want to be redundant. While we're aware that they entered into an agreement, and we commend them for entering an agreement with the associated communities, we would like to see a citywide community benefits agreement. We also request periodic reports to both the Board of Estimates, City Council, the Board of Finance on the progress, especially MBE, WBE, local hiring goals, and inclusionary housing. So that's another one of the demands that the comptroller is seeking. One final one, let's see here. We also like to have informational hearings conducted by the council to periodically review each tranche before it comes to the Board of Estimates. And finally, there's one final one that we also have that deals with Sagamore is going to act as the master developer, and some of these parcels are going to be farmed out to other developers to construct. The comptroller would like to see a requirement based on those future sites that are going to be developed to include minority participation in the ownership entity. With that, there are the comments from the Comptroller's Office. Thank you for allowing me the time to have this presentation before you.
Yes, we do. You have it? Yeah, it doesn't have a name on it. Thank you. Thank you very much, and we'll follow up with the Comptroller. So, we're now going to ask Tischler Bice to come up as a panel. As they're coming forward. Hi. So Tischler Bice is a firm that was retained by the BUILD organization to conduct a technical review of the fiscal impact analysis that was included as part of the Sagamore TIF application. Now, I want to be absolutely clear in terms of Tischler Bice that my understanding is that you had no prior relationship with BUILD, and that your review of the Sagamore TIF fiscal impact analysis does not imply an endorsement of BUILD's demands or opinions or their agenda. You are not at all endorsing the BUILD agenda. Am I correct in that?
That's correct.
Okay. Would you introduce yourself and go?
Yes, thank you. My name is Malcolm McKittrick. I'm a fiscal and economic analyst with Tischler Bice. We're based in Bethesda, Maryland. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to speak. Tischler Bice is an urban planning firm based out of Bethesda with a 35-year national practice. We specialize in fiscal impact analysis. We're considered an authority on fiscal impact analysis. We've also done more impact fees than any other firm in the country. We do a lot of infrastructure financing strategy work, market analysis and feasibility work, and tax differential studies, particularly in Maryland. I want to just go ahead and frame our involvement here with the project. We were scoped to just analyze the fiscal impact analysis that was submitted as part of the TIF application. In general, our conclusion as urban planners is that the Port Covington project represents a great opportunity for the city for redevelopment. We note that by our review, it conforms with the Middle Branch Master Plan and the South Baltimore Gateway Master Plan, both of which would prefer a conversion of industrial land to a mixed-use hub south of city center. The project also has the potential to create thousands of new jobs, generate economic spin-off impacts that would reverberate throughout the region. It represents a major reinvestment in the city and the opportunity to enhance the tax base. With that said, with such a large-scale development, we think that a clear and transparent fiscal impact analysis report is imperative to analyze the fiscal impact of this project long-term. So our first finding is that the fiscal impact analysis report lacks basic information. There's no narrative on methodologies or assumptions included. That is absolutely the state of the practice. You'll note that the fiscal impact analysis, which comes at the end of the TIF application, is a rather lengthy report with a lot of detail, but most of it's spreadsheets with methodologies included in the footnotes. You'll note to the right of this slide, I hope it doesn't look particularly clear, but in essence, the point is that any good fiscal impact analysis is going to include an extensive narrative on methodologies employed, major assumptions, absorption rates, just actual text narrative, because this is a rather complex issue, and some sort of textual explanation should be included, not just spreadsheets. The second finding is that the city operating costs are probably understated in the fiscal impact analysis. Based on our experience, we want to preface this by saying that in all likelihood, the development probably delivers a net positive fiscal impact to the city. It's a matter of how net positive. Entire divisions of certain departments are assumed not to be impacted, in other words, fixed in this report. Now, that may very well be the case, but there's no narrative to explain how those assumptions were vetted, which again is standard practice in the field. So, you have whole divisions within sheriff, police, health, and transportation, for example, that are assumed to be fixed, and we don't know why. Now, the consultant that was hired by the city may very well have visited with staff. We understand that's the case, but why not include that in the report and be as transparent as possible about your process? I'll give you an example. There's no explanation for why snow and ice removal is a non-impacted division. This is a development that's going to add, we're told, 41 blocks, I think. That's a significant amount of lane mileage. Why is snow and ice not impacted? Now, it could be there's excess capacity in the division to handle those, increased demands, but we'd like to know why. A simple explanation doesn't have to be much, just a sentence or two. It's standard practice. A bigger problem that we have is that the consultant essentially uses an average costing methodology, which can tend to sort of mask the timing and absorption of new development. We'd prefer marginal costing. Let me delve into that a little bit more. Take police patrol, for example. With an average costing technique, you'd take a budget line item, you'd figure out demand. That might be employees, it might be residents, it might be a service population, it could be students, it could be lane miles, vehicle trips, non-residential vehicle trips generated, all sorts of things that you think represents increased demand on municipal services. So you take the line item and you divide it by that demand unit. So say, for instance, you determine that $250 per service population added is the cost annually for police patrol. Well, let's say you have 500 people in the demand units in the first year, that's $125K impact. But in reality, that's not how police services are delivered. So you might have a new development forming and you need 3 or 4 different, beat cops on the scene, right? So if each of them has a salary and benefits of, say, 80 or 90K, you're talking about an impact immediately, a lumpy impact in the beginning of the project that's more in the neighborhood of 350, 360K. So that's what we're talking about with average costing versus marginal costing. Average costing is incremental over time. As the project absorption occurs, those increments are expressed in, say, like $250 for a particular service. Marginal costing is going to say, hey, we got this big development occurring right now south of the city. We're going to need 3 or 4 cops patrolling that area. And so it acknowledges that sort of lumpy aspect to budgeting. Another major finding from our analysis of the fiscal impact analysis is that no capital costs outside of TIF financed infrastructure are included. Now, the fiscal impact analysis report does a good job of detailing all of the TIF financed projects, but we'd like to know what the impacts are for other capital projects that aren't included in the TIF financed schedule. So there's no discussion of how the development will impact other capital expenditures, for instance, fire, police, schools, library, water, and sewer. We understand that there's a lot of water and sewer infrastructure that's going to be TIF financed, but what about system-wide? What about treatment? If they're not going to be impacted, put them in the report. It's a simple narrative. Again, just be transparent about it. Fire, you might have excess capacity. You might have a huge station right nearby. You might assume it's not impacted. But again, just put it in the narrative. Schools, you could have system-wide capacity. But what's the capacity at local elementary, middle, and high schools where these kids are going to go? Same goes with the library branch. Is that going to be needed? A police substation? These are all things that need to be answered. And if there are assumptions that were vetted with city staff, they can easily be detailed in the narrative. So, and again, apologize that this isn't particularly clear, but here's an example from a project of ours in Windsor, Connecticut, that shows sort of the difference between marginal and average costing. You'll see, there are 2 scenarios. One's a developer-preferred scenario, where development occurs rather rapidly, and another is based on a city market analysis that assumes slower absorption rate. And what you'll see is these big dips in the net fiscal impact. Mind you, this is all positive. But these big dips represent capital investments that the city has to make. and they're not incremental, they're not linear. They come at certain times when you have to make an investment once capacity is reached. And you'll see those dips right there. You know, there's a public school, there's a fire station, there's apparatus that's represented. So this marginal costing approach is much more detailed, and it represents over time a much more accurate representation of costs to the city. You'll see here also that and again, I apologize for the clarity here, but that this project in Windsor, Connecticut was also a TIF project. It was a TIF analysis. And we included estimates of both TIF-financed infrastructure and public capital costs, all the way down to fire apparatus, you know, ambulances, the whole shebang. So, I mean, I think that this is a more accurate way to reflect capital costs that will be incurred for a municipality based on increased demand from new development. So our fourth finding is that we really felt that multiple scenarios should be presented. I mean, we've all experienced the past recession, you know, 2008, 2009, 2010. We know the market's rapidly changing. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, our firm does a ton of market analysis. You know, multiple scenarios should really be included in analysis for a project of this magnitude. You know, we've heard that this was completed internally, but only one scenario is represented in the report. And, you know, if you found that all the scenarios you've tested have a net fiscal positive outcome, why not put that in the report? At least you're informing the public, you're informing elected officials, and, you know, you're also saying, hey, you know, over a 40-year period, a lot could change. We should test various scenarios. And do that at the outset. Don't think that, you know, one scenario is going to work. In fact, we work nationally, and, you know, a lot of our fiscal impact analysis work, you know, developers come back and say, hey, you know, retail isn't what it was when we got this passed. Let's start putting in more residential units. So things change with the market. It makes sense to analyze multiple scenarios. You know, sort of piggybacking on that, a market analysis wasn't included with the application. I'm sure that one was done, but for a project that represents this amount of public investment, public dollars, I really think a market analysis should be included with the application or made publicly available. The importance of this market analysis is, A, to show various types of demand for different types of land use, but also to support the absorption assumptions that were included in the analysis in the one scenario. The market analysis could also be critical to informing other types of scenarios that could be tested for a fiscal impact analysis. For instance, here's a project that we did in Colorado, in the city of Lone Tree. We also analyzed the fiscal impact of this project for a special district. This is a 2,400-acre project, so a rather large one with a huge potential fiscal impact to the municipality. And we tested multiple scenarios derived from a market analysis. You know, in Colorado, municipalities live and die by sales tax revenue. You know, they don't get property tax revenue. So we tested what would happen as the project built out if there was less retail. The other big piece here was that this area was expected to be served by a light rail stop, much like Port Covington. So we wanted to look at, what happens if that happens, if the light rail stop is built, in 5 to 10 years versus 30 years. That's obviously going to affect, the attractiveness of the site, property values, that sort of thing. So in this case, we analyzed 4 different scenarios, and we're able to sort of provide stress testing of all the assumptions in the development. So in summary, our findings are that this is in fact a potentially transformative project. I don't think there's any question about it. It presents a huge opportunity for the city. And also, it'll likely result in net fiscal impact over an extended period of time, like 40 years. The question is by how much, and how does that inform a discussion about a public subsidy? A project of this magnitude should really have an extensive supporting narrative with it. It can't just be all spreadsheets. As I mentioned before, this is a complex topic and needs to be approachable as much as possible to as many stakeholders as are involved in the project. And finally, a project of this magnitude should really be analyzed with a marginal cost methodology. It really is the state of the practice. Average costing, we call it sort of the quick and dirty method. It can be come out with similar results, but we find over time that marginal costing is more accurate. And that marginal costing methodology should really have non-TIF capital costs and multiple scenarios informed by a publicly available market analysis. So with that, we'll take any questions if you have them.
Thank you. Councilman Costello.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for that. That was very informational. I also had an opportunity to review in detail Municap's response to that, and I assume that you've had an opportunity to do the same.
Yes, yeah.
Stay at the mic for us, please.
Yes, I'm sorry, momentary lapse there. Yes, we reviewed that memorandum.
So in reviewing your analysis, I didn't see anything in the methodology about at which point you interviewed individuals that were involved in the development of this document, whether it be Municap officials or even going a step further to speak with city officials, for example, BDC or Department of Finance, or even one step further, the developer, in this case, Sagamore. So I'm left wondering how you can be so certain that the Municap analysis is so flawed when there's no explanation of the conversations that you've had, because one of the things that you faulted Municap for, I believe it was recommendation number 4, had to do with their methodology.
Mm-hmm.
So can you walk me through
Yeah,
that?
sure. The simple question is, we shouldn't have to do that due diligence. This is a public record document that's meant to be of use to the public, and a narrative that makes it comprehensive and understandable should be included. It's standard practice in fiscal impact analysis.
I'm just lost as to how you can make 9 or 10 recommendations about the credibility of that analysis of a firm who works for the city to protect the city's financial interests, right? They don't have a special interest in this. They don't have any stake other than the city's fiscal health. And how you could make several of these assumptions, which to me seemed very clearly rebutted in the Municap analysis, without talking to anyone that was involved in this.
Look, I mean, I'll say it again. This is the state of the practice. I mean, you're going to have a report here with a number of spreadsheets, and the only real narrative is in footnotes. I mean, we've done a number of these nationally, and we've never seen something like this before. I mean, fiscal impact analysis always has a narrative.
If I may. Hi, good evening. I'm Julie Herlands. I'm a principal with Tischler Weiss. I'm here to answer questions as well. So in terms of our documentation and our findings, we were pretty clear about saying it's quite possible that there's a net positive here, that it is fiscally beneficial. However, why not set out the parameters, the standard assumptions, the foundational assumptions on which those numbers are given. So if you really read our memo and you read the rebuttal, there were really no, you're right, you're wrong, we're right, et cetera, et cetera. There were several, there were on pretty much across the board, our criticism of multiple scenarios. They came back and said, well, we did do multiple scenarios. There's no documentation in there, the application of multiple scenarios. There's one scenario that's shown. So great, so multiple scenarios, please, provide those. And our charge really was a high-level review of what was submitted. It wasn't to do a full fiscal analysis. And if we were charged to do a full fiscal analysis, you better believe we would have spent a week up here up in Baltimore, up the highway. So when we do our fiscal analysis, we're sitting down with departments, doing interviews, understanding where there's capacity, where there's a need for additional public facilities, what's being funded by TIF, what's not being funded by TIF, where the students are coming from, what type of units are being developed, what kind of kids are coming out of those units. So that's the due diligence we would do, but we just don't know given what was submitted.
I think maybe there's some confusion on your part on your assumption in what I'm assuming that I'm taking issue with here. I'm not pointing out any one of these individual recommendations. There were some things that you said that were positive about the prospect for this development, some things that were negative. I'm not taking issue with that. I'm taking issue with the fact that you're making assumptions based on your analysis of that report without having spoken to anyone. And to me, I think that's a flawed analysis. Mr. Chairman, at some point, and I don't know when it makes sense, could we bring up Municap to rebut?
Yes, I do want to get to the public. I obviously asked Municap to speak earlier. They chose not to. And I know what they said. I've got 1,000 people in here, maybe not 1,000, but so I don't want to spend time back and forth. We have the written reports from everybody. We have the blowback from, excuse the term, but from Municap. The bottom line is, yes, sir, we will do that, but not immediately. Not immediately. We will do that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it.
Yes, thank you. I have a couple of questions, but I do want to move forward. If you guys would stick around, though, I would appreciate that. So let us go to the build panel, please. You can pull the mic and bring it over to the table if you prefer.
Okay, can I just stand?
You can take the mic if you want to the table, or you can just individually go there.
We've just been sitting for a while, Council President. Is it okay? My name is the Reverend Glenna Huber. I am an Episcopal priest in the Diocese of Maryland. I am the clergy co-chair of BUILD. Thank you, Mr. Chair, Council President Young, and City Council members. There were a lot of people who were here earlier tonight, and due to the late time, we have lost a large number of folks. But I do want to take this minute to thank the residents who stood outside in the heat and have hung in for 4+ hours to lend their voice to one of the largest TIF requests in the history of this state. BUILD, after having listened to over 5,000 city residents in churches, faith institutions, kitchens, and schools across the city, we have come before you today to say, here we go again. Does anybody here remember the movie Groundhog Day? Bill Murray repeated the same day over and over and over again, and it's as if Baltimore is having its own version of Groundhog Day. We've been here before, over and over and over, hearing the promises of wealthy developers to trust and wait. Wait while they build yet another project using public subsidy. They say the residents of the city will get jobs. They say housing. They say revival of the city's tax base if we, the residents, just step aside, provide the funding and the city's credit rating, and wait. Well, they said the same thing when they built the Inner Harbor. They said the same thing when they built those 2 stadiums. They said the same thing when they built Harbor East and Harbor Point. And we, Build, United in Leadership Development, and the rest of Baltimore City find ourselves still waiting as Uptown residents fill seasonal and temporary jobs. We find ourselves still waiting as our tax base increases, but Uptown school buildings fall apart. We find ourselves still waiting on promises that will never be fulfilled. And here we come again. They, this time in the form of Sagamore Developments and Mr. Mark Weller, are again saying, trust us. We will build it together. It's impossible to trust when you've been played so many times. This time, it has to be different. Groundhog Day for developers has got to come to an end. It can't be them building Port Covington with vague trickle-down promises for us in the neighborhoods in the city. City Council, maybe you seem stuck in Groundhog Day. We know that many of you love developers. Most recently in the support of Mr. Beatty at Harbor Point, a highly contested investment by the city. History has shown your unwavering support for developers with non-binding promises. The question before you is, will today be different? Are you going to stand up this time and support the tax-paying residents of Baltimore, the children of Baltimore, the generations of Baltimore residents who will be affected by this deal? Mr. Plank and Under Armour have a saying, we will protect this house. Well, who's going to protect this house that we call Baltimore? Will this be our chance? City Council, residents, developers, will this be our chance to protect our house and build one Baltimore? Not if you, City Council President and Council, fast-track a poorly vetted billion-dollar 40-year deal. Not if you, City Council and Council President, fail to listen to leading financial experts who say the numbers don't add up, the costs are underestimated, then try to slide in some kayak landings as a but-if necessity. Not if you, Council President and Council members, put your full trust in a MuniCap analysis, the same group that analyzed other city developments that are not yet living up to their full projections, the latest being Harbor Point, which only after 2 years has returned to the city for more money as a result of 3 times cost overruns. We are not building together if a community of benefits agreement fails to provide 51% local hiring on all jobs, not just new jobs. We are not building together if a CBA fails to deliver on at least 20% affordable housing, if it fails to keep education harmless for more than 3 years, fails to indicate profit margin percentages before the deal is signed, and offers no accountability measures to ensure a binding contract. Members of the Tax and Finance Committee, members of the full council, Council President Jack Young, Build calls on you to stand up. Conduct a comprehensive independent analysis of this deal. Take the time to structure the deal with guarantees that benefit the entire city. To call for a full council vote on August 8th continues a history of investing in waterfront while the neighborhoods languish. Don't rush. Do your job. Check the numbers. The citizens of Baltimore want to protect our house. We are calling on you, councilpersons, slow down, do your due diligence. The scale of this Port Covington project and the size of this public financing, this is the largest ever in this state. The scale requires you, City Council, to fully vet a generational deal. No more business as usual. We cannot afford business as usual. There are people on our streets crying out, we cannot do business as usual anymore. Stand up. Stand up with BUILD, stand up with labor unions, stand up with the ACLU, stand up for the citizens of Roland Park, Forest Park, Pigtown, and Sandtown. Do your part. Protect our house. Then yes, we can solve it together.
Thank you, Reverend. Thank you, Reverend Huber. I must mention, because we have other panels and all those who have come tonight, I must mention, because we have other panels and 130 people signed up, and Reverend, that was a great, we appreciate it, but you actually used all of your time doing that. I would ask. All right, the longer we do, the shorter we have. So I would ask that the other three do shortened remarks, please.
Okay. All right, I talk fast anyway. I would just like to begin by saying thank you for the opportunity to represent the youth of Baltimore. Good evening, everyone. My name is Samara Franklin. I'm an 18-year-old recent graduate of historic Western High School. I am also a leader with Baltimore Youth Organizing Project, a youth organizing initiative created by BUILD and No Boundaries Coalition. I'm a resident of Sandtown Winchester community, a neighborhood that has been at the epicenter of the most recent unrest. Last year's unrest happened because there have been decades of disinvestment in neighborhoods outside of the waterfront. And there have been decades of disinvestment in the youth of Baltimore City. This city is extremely nearsighted. The elders and those who hold public office are not looking to the future. I will be 59 when this TIF is paid. Sagamore promises we will build it together. How will we build together when I nor my peers were asked for our input? No one has asked us if we are willing to carry the burden of this TIF for the next 41 years. How is it that a year after the unrest, when the city promised they would invest in the youth, they did not make my peers or myself a priority when this TIF was considered? I have done an enormous amount of organizing over the last year, trying to make long-lasting change for the youth of Baltimore. What has this city done to validate what we have heard from over 400 youth after the unrest? Excuse me. The youth demand year-long employment, safe schools, safe neighborhoods, and youth opportunities. What will this TIF do to help us meet their demands? This year, I voted for the first time. I also flew on an airplane for the first time to the world's deadliest country, El Salvador. I was not afraid to get on that plane and go to a place where I had never been. But my stomach was in knots when I voted. I knew it was such an important decision, and I wanted to make sure I was making all the right choices to ensure that my voice is heard in Baltimore. I need this council to make the right choice. I need you to say no until there is an independent investigation of how this TIF will affect me and this city for the next 41 years. I need to make sure that my peers have a chance for employment over the next 41 years. That Port Covington that pays into profit sharing that will benefit all of the communities around Baltimore. And I need to make sure that when I'm a parent and a grandparent, that the education of my children and grandchildren will not be cut due to wealth that is not real, but only perceived. Youth like myself want more, and deserve more. This city needs to stand up for us. I am what the city will become. You must invest in me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Leila Campbell. I work closely with the Harlem Park West Community Association, which is a BUILD member. Harlem Park West is one of the most impoverished communities in Baltimore City, but this is also a community with a rich history. Harlem Park residents past and present include Clarence and Perrin Mitchell, who fought for civil rights for all. Robert Campbell, who opened up various businesses, utilizing his income and resources to create jobs, affordable housing, and help support families in need during times of crisis. In Harlem Park West, we've housed the Maryland Normal School, an institution that later became Towson State University, the Maryland School for the Blind, which also was the first site for Morgan State University. There are still residents and businesses today who try hard to work with city leaders and partners to preserve Harlem Park's rich history and build a bright future. There are similar communities throughout the Baltimore city as well. But what has happened to make neighborhoods like Harlem Park, Darley Park, Oliver, and Johnston Square invisible? A report released by our Baltimore City Health Department in December 2011 stated that Harlem Park has an unemployment rate of 1 in 5, nearly double that of Baltimore as a whole. More than half of all households in Harlem Park earn $25,000 a year, can't live in poor Covington. Life expectancy is 6.5 years shorter than any communities in Baltimore overall. In conclusion, communities like Darley Park, Johnston Square, Oliver, and Harlem Park West continue to be redlined when it comes to jobs, development, transportation, educational needs, health, recreation, and safety. Sagamore Development's president, Mr. Weller, stated in the Baltimore Sun that he strongly believes in the transformative nature of Port Covington project for Baltimore, and the entire state, and the broad impact it will have on people's lives who live in the city, not just one area of the city. With all of the city and state's resources that will be pulled toward this project, Mr. Chair and committee members, I simply want to know, is Darley Park included? Is Johnston Square included? Is Oliver included? Is Harlem Park included? Does this broad impact that Mr. Weller believes will have on people's lives include the residents of these communities, Mr. Chair and committee members, or are we talking about two Baltimores? Will anything from this project, from shovel in the ground to 40 years from now, benefit an already invisible community that lacks every type of resource known to this city and state, to include trash collection and police protection? Are we talking to Baltimore's? We are here to stand up for our invisible communities. We are here to stand up for Darley Park, for Oliver, for Johnston Square, Harlem Park West, and others like it. Mr. Chair and committee members, we can do better. We want better for these invisible communities. We stand with our voices and our votes. And all we're asking is that you don't rush this process. We're asking that you hold off on this vote until the whole of Baltimore can benefit.
I will. Hold on. Reverend, before you speak, I know better than to ask a Baptist minister.
Then don't do it.
Because I know in your last 30 seconds, 30 minutes later, but I do want to say this very clearly to those who are patient enough to have stayed. 1, there will be no vote tonight. 2, there will be no vote next week. 3, there will be no vote the following week. There will be, let me, again, the president of the council and this committee are committed to making sure that we have the best possible bill before we bring it before the full city council. Reverend.
Thank you, Councilman Stokes. To all that are here today assembled, my name is Calvin Keene. I am a lifelong resident of Baltimore City. I'm the pastor of the Memorial Baptist Church, which is located in the Oliver community. To the Taxation, Finance, and Economic Development Committee of the Baltimore City Council, I just need to make sure that you heard what Reverend Huber had to say to you. What she was telling you is that this is not business as usual in our city. We are simply demanding a no vote from this committee until an independent analysis of the Port Covington TIF application has been rendered and a deal that benefits all of Baltimore's neighborhoods has been agreed to. We are all the communities of Baltimore City, from Sandtown to Pigtown, from Harlem Park to Howard Park, from Perkins Homes to McCullough Homes, from Penn North to Greenmount West. Build one Baltimore. Stand up, Build. Stand up, Labor. Stand up, Build Baltimore Coalition. Stand up, Port Cube Coalition. Stand up, neighborhoods. Chairman Stokes, Councilwoman Holton, Councilman Henry, Branch is gone. Stand up with us and let's build one Baltimore. Port Covington, we will build it together. It's a nice slogan, but we are not building it together when there is no community benefit agreement that says a commitment to 51% Baltimore resident hires for all jobs, not just new jobs. We're not building together if there's no community benefit agreement that delivers 20% affordable housing. Let's build it together. We're not building it together when there's no community benefit agreement to hold education harmless for the full 40 years of the TIF. Stand up with us, City Council. Stand up with us, Council President Young. Say no to the one-night stands. Say no to agreements without guarantees. Say no to smooth talk and slick slogans. And together, we will build one Baltimore.
Thank you. Committee, council members, any comment, questions? Thank you. Let me make one real big housekeeping announcement here. I was going to give it to Councilman Henry, but I will take it. We're going to have housing, labor, and I think the Baltimore Urban League has left, but they did leave testimony. And then we're going to go to public testimony for as long as we can. I've been told that we must leave the building at 10 p.m. So let me say that instead of a work session next week, we will recess this hearing and continue the hearing, picking up on the speakers wherever we end tonight. You've already signed in. We will continue the testimony another week, and then we will have the work session on the following week. So could the housing advocates please come forward to begin your 10-minute panel? Is the housing still here? That's Ms. Samuels, Mr. Williams, Mr. Schneider, and Dr. Brown. Okay. We okay? I want you to take the microphone from the podium, or if you're going to use the podium, you can, or you can bring the microphone to the table. Are you guys ready to go? Please, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. President, members of the City Council. Oh, My name is Barbara Samuels. I'm the fair housing attorney for the Maryland ACLU. Our interest in this was initially captured by looking at the affordable housing issues. But I also have to say that the more you dig into this, the more you find that this is a fiscally irresponsible proposal. The lack of a market study to show a demand for 5,000, 7,500, 14,000, whatever units are being projected now, is simply outside the practice in the industry, even for the smallest affordable housing project. And similarly, the lack of the scenario analysis, as you've heard before. But also, you've heard a lot today about returns to the city as a result of this project. 40 million a year, 1.7 billion over 41 years has been thrown around. What they have not told you, and what they have never said, but which is hidden in the TIF itself, is that when you reduce that amount to present value, because it's over a 41-year period, and today's dollars are worth more than dollars 40 years from now, the present value of that 1.7 billion is only 227 million. Now that's still a positive, but it is a far cry from the 1.7 billion, and any economist would tell you that you need to do that. Now, on the affordable housing front, we've also heard that because there was no money in a city inclusionary housing fund, that this project should be exempt. That is not what the city inclusionary law says. Yes, it's a weak law, but it's not that weak. The city can use any source of money to help pay for the affordable housing. One obvious source in this case is the TIF itself, and in fact the law directs the housing commissioner to look at the major public subsidy and the value of the rezoning to determine whether the developer has been made whole. One would think that with the $660 million TIF and a rezoning for 14,000 units, that the developer would be made whole. But we don't actually need all that money to do affordable housing. And so what we're asking for is 25% affordable, because we have both a major rezoning and a major public subsidy of unprecedented dimensions, and the 20% of the TIF be reserved and set aside for the affordable housing. Now that will come to enough to cover the estimates that the Housing Department and Sagamore put together, which in our view were greatly inflated, but nonetheless it would cover that portion. And so we should not let anyone say that affordable housing is too difficult to do here or too impossible, or that there are not resources. Affordable housing deals are always complicated to put together. There is nothing special about this deal. In fact, the amount of resources here should make it easier rather than harder. And so in the interest of making this an inclusive project, one that includes a range of incomes, a range of family sizes, not just millennials living in studio and one-bedroom high-rises, we need to revamp the residential program for this TIF, and as a condition of the TIF, impose these requirements. This needs to be done now, as does the fiscal responsibility. Once you have authorized the TIF, you have given away the city's bargaining position. You have given away the leverage. So due diligence after the authorization does no good. That's not how any responsible lender would operate, and that's not how the city should operate. So we have actually submitted some amendment language. We'd be happy to talk with Sagamore about how to make this happen. We'd be happy to talk with the housing commissioner. And to a great extent, with all due respect, I think the citizens are actually saving Sagamore from themselves, because there is no reason to think that a city within a city of 14,000 high-rise units, studio and one bedroom for millennials, is going to materialize. We are going to end up either with vacant lots or empty high-rises. So let's take a step back. Let's revamp this, and there's no reason we can't do that. There should not be any rush, because out of that first tranche of bonds that we're rushing to do, there is no money in that for streets or sewers or infrastructure to help Sagamore get on with their expansion. It's all for the amenities. It's all for the archaeological pier and the 2 parks. So it cannot be that much of a rush. I want to give my colleagues their due, so I'm going to step aside. We do have written testimony that hopefully has been passed out.
Thank you, Ms. Samus. We do have your testimony.
Hi, my name is Anthony Williams, and I'm a member of Housing Our Neighbors. We have a housing crisis in Baltimore City. Every day, we are seeing homeless people living on the streets and living in shelters that are in terrible conditions. I myself have been homeless on and off for years. I just got housed, but before that, I was working, making $15 an hour, and homeless, living on the street. I was working, paying taxes, and still could not find affordable housing in Baltimore. Unfortunately, my story is not unique. There are 2,500 people experiencing homelessness on any given night, and 50% of the people of Baltimore City struggling to pay their rents every month. Baltimore, let's get our priorities straight. We've seen development like this time and time again. Baltimore City subsidized trickle-down development that does not meet the needs of the city residents. Sagamore Development has refused to develop affordable housing. It has only pledged to make 10% of the units in Port Covington affordable to families of 4 making over $70,000 a year. This is far from the reality of Baltimoreans. This project will be a segregated community within our own city borders. And in fact, the project will divert resources away from the people and programs that really need it. This is failed development. Baltimore City, let's get our priorities straight. The Housing Our Neighbors Act would create thousands of affordable housing units in Port Covington. It requires that 1/5 of the housing units be made affordable to people with incomes at 30% of the area median income. Given the overwhelming amount of public investment in the project, this bill requires Sagamore to cover the cost of creating these affordable housing units. We are urging you to support the Housing Our Neighbors Act, number 160712, number 160712, because we all need access to decent affordable housing. We are standing up for affordable housing. We are standing up for fair development. We are standing up for jobs. We are standing up for education. We are standing up for a living wage. We are standing up for health care.
I don't know if I can follow that.
passion, but my name is Adam Schneider. I'm with Healthcare for the Homeless. Healthcare for the Homeless's efforts to prevent and end homelessness are deeply connected to the decisions that you all have before you, because homelessness results from poverty. And in the wealthiest state, in the wealthiest country in the history of the world, poverty is the result of inequality. It also results from a lack of affordable housing. And we've heard that people don't want two Baltimores, but it's important to recognize that two Baltimores didn't simply happen. Racial and economic segregation and exclusion are neither natural nor inevitable. They were created by public policies, especially and including development policies. So this is critical to deciding and determining what type of Baltimore we are going to have and for whom. Reverend Huber said more eloquently than I could ever, took us through the histories from Charles Place to Harbor Place to Harbor Point to Harbor East. We've created Potemkin villages, Disney-fied enclaves on the water for affluent, mostly white folk, while blocks away people are suffering in poverty. That sounds terribly concerning when we are considering another enclave on the water that is getting public subsidies and could be turned into a place that is for some at the exclusion of others. We don't want two Baltimores, and so we need to ask whether Port Covington is something new or whether past, in this case, is prologue, and in fact, whether it's past is prologue on steroids. So we need to ask whether this development will decrease inequality. It's hard to imagine that that could possibly happen when an ostensibly poor city is considering giving hundreds of millions of dollars to a billionaire without demanding public goods for everyone across the city. But let's just take that off the table for a second and focus on a second. It's also hard to see how we're going to close the gap between what people can afford and the cost of housing when only 10% of the units are affordable, and they will be affordable maybe to some of the social workers at Healthcare for the Homeless, but none of the people that we serve. Certainly none of the 90,000 households in Baltimore City today, every month, who cannot afford to pay their housing. We need to do better than this. $46,000 to $69,000, that is not low income. We've heard that there is a goal of 10% of affordable units, but we need more than that. We need more than a philosophical commitment. We need a legal commitment. We need actual housing units that are affordable to the lowest income of our neighbors. Luckily, as Anthony said, we have a bill that will help to make this possible. And so the question that is before you all, it's entirely reasonable that Sagamore would ask for public subsidies. Their goal, fundamentally, their goal is to generate profits. It has to be. That's what their goal is. They are a business, that's what they're about. And we can't necessarily criticize them for that. What you all have to do is determine whether public subsidies are going to be used to enrich private developers or whether they are going to be used to benefit the people of Baltimore. That is the question. That is the question that you all have to think about, that you all have to decide. And that's a serious question, and we ask for your serious concern and your support.
Thank you.
Thank you for this hearing. The question before us is one that is serious. You've heard from ACLU, you've heard from Housing Our Neighbors, you've heard from Healthcare for the Homeless. Housing is a real issue in Baltimore City. The median annual income in Baltimore is $42,000. That means that half of our residents could not afford to live in Port Covington. So inclusion is a real issue. Dr. Martin Luther King, 7 days after he died, after he was assassinated, the 1968 Fair Housing Act was put into law. And that law gave government the authority and the mandate to affirmatively further fair housing, which President Obama passed a HUD rule last year to affirmatively further fair housing with HUD. So what we're saying is, since Sagamore is looking for 8.5% of the population as African American, given that that's what the creative class is nationally, if that becomes the population of that community, it becomes the 5th least black community in the entire city. And this is a city that's 63% black. We cannot allow that to happen. We cannot allow that. We must have racial integration to help desegregate Baltimore City. Because the two Baltimores that we have are the white L and the black butterfly. And we have to deconstruct that if we want this city to be whole in one Baltimore. So I urge you to listen very carefully to what the ACLU is saying, to what Housing Our Neighbors is saying, to what Healthcare for the Homeless is saying, and to listen to the very strong activism that Dr. King gave his life for to affirmatively further fair housing.
Thank you. Colleagues, nothing? Okay. Would the labor union please come forward? Thank you. And again, thank everyone for their patience this evening.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Ernie Greco. I'm president of the Metropolitan Baltimore Council of the AFL-CIO unions. That organization has 189 local unions and represents somewhere around 150,000 working men and women in this area. We just had our monthly meeting just last Thursday. Our executive board and the delegate meeting of our unions. At that meeting, just about the entire subject matter was Port Covington. Of that 189 unions, not every one is going to garnish jobs. But we do have quite a few. And the outcome of that meeting was that regardless, this is one of the most important issues of the AFL-CIO in the metropolitan Baltimore area. And even though some of our organizations will not get jobs, and that's what the unions are all about, jobs and more jobs. Even if the unions do not get any jobs out of it, they are in full support. And I'm talking about unions like the firefighters and the steel workers and the auto workers and so many more. There is even some that are signed up tonight of that 130. There's some here in the hall that want to testify, and their testimony is going to be very brief, just saying that they're in support of the building trades, and the unions asked me, the Unite Here organization, and the transit division. So again, I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank you, Mr. Chair, President Young, for allowing us to be here to have this panel. We would hope that you heard so many things tonight. We're going to be as brief as we can. We hope to stay within the 10-minute rule.
Thank you,
Our
Mr.
next speaker is Brother Mark Coles from Choice. And
thank you, Ernie. Good evening, everyone. My name is Mark Coles. I'm the Executive Director of the Community Hub for Opportunities and Construction Employment, Choice. We represent 28 building trades unions in the greater Baltimore, Washington, D.C., Northern Virginia region. We have 17 building trades local unions and 18 apprenticeship centers that serve Baltimore. Currently, 1,500 members of the local building trades unions reside in Baltimore City. Our building trades unions and our community allies are tirelessly working to catapult victims of inequality into the middle class by prepping them for skilled trades apprenticeship programs that put them on career pathways. I am here today because Choice stands united with Build Up Baltimore, a coalition of like-minded faith, community, and labor organizations to build a better Baltimore. Choice is here today advocating for a comprehensive and legally enforceable community benefits agreement that requires employers to pay workers family sustainable wages and benefits while also providing formal mechanisms that will connect local residents to employment and apprenticeship training opportunities that result in skill sets that last a lifetime and lead to sustainable middle-class construction careers. I believe that we can all agree that development can be a good thing, and that particularly a development of this size has the potential to be revolutionary for the city. In its current state, the deal presented before the City Council and the city at large does not go far enough to provide real opportunity to better the lives of Baltimore City residents, particularly those living in low-income communities. We are also concerned that this massive Port Covington TIF has not gone through a real public vetting process. Tischler B's independent analysis of the Port Covington development raises too many questions for the city to move forward without commissioning its own independent analysis. Specifically, questions have been raised regarding the real number of new jobs to be created at the site, concerns about the total cost of new city services, and the use of TIF bonds. Choice stands with Build Up Baltimore, Port Cube, and Build in recommending that the City Council add an amendment that requires a comprehensive citywide community benefits agreement as part of the TIF authorization. This comprehensive community benefits agreement should include a commitment to the creation of good, sustainable jobs for Baltimore residents, with real opportunity for low-income communities and communities of color. To this end, the City Council should require in the CBA amendment inclusion of community workforce standards applied over the lifetime of the TIF that would establish an enforceable local hire commitment that requires 51% of all hours worked targeted by city residents, require partnering with employers who provide family sustainable wages and benefits and will connect local residents to employment and on-the-job training opportunities with clear pathways to middle-class careers, and establish an apprenticeship readiness program that facilitates direct entry of targeted residents into high-quality registered apprenticeship programs and that operates under a formal partnership between government, community, business, professional associations that represent minority, women, small business, and labor coalitions. In closing, Port Covington should set a new standard for public accountability. We believe this TIF presents an opportunity for this City Council to end an era of failed commitments and promises by creating a lasting legacy rooted in the concept of, if you ask city residents to subsidize your project, you will adhere to a binding set of standards so that the entire city gets a return on their subsidy. We at Choice, Build, Port Cube, and Build Up Baltimore stand up for the rights of Baltimore City residents to ensure that the city's subsidies are used for the public benefit. We ask the City Council to require that this TIF legislation include a comprehensive citywide community benefits agreement that is in effect on all aspects of the project for the duration of the subsidy. Absent an enforceable mechanism such as this, the City of Baltimore cannot fully rebuild. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chairman Stokes and members of the Taxation, Finance, and Economic Development Committee for holding this important meeting. My name is David Allison, I'm with the Laborers International Union of North America, Baltimore, Washington District Council. We represent 6,500 construction and public employed laborers in the Baltimore, Washington metropolitan area and have over 200 signatory employers that employ our members. Project labor agreements set a wage floor based on what prevails in a community, ensuring that an influx of taxpayer construction investment doesn't drive down or inflate local wage standards, and workers receive benefits such as health care and pensions, preventing a burden on local services. A Port Covington TIF PLA would include wage and benefit standards, including a requirement for contractors to pay family-sustaining wages and provide for health care and retirement for all workers. A minimum local hiring goal of 51% and above for all work hours on the project to be performed by local Baltimore City residents. Targeted hiring of members of disadvantaged communities and low-income individuals typically underrepresented in the construction industry, or pursuing construction careers through trade apprenticeship programs and in conjunction with community-based pre-apprenticeship and job training programs. Also, State of Maryland certified apprenticeship goals, making sure that a certain percentage of the work is performed by members of the community in an apprenticeship program with one of the trades. The system provides the most cost-effective construction training mechanisms in the United States at no cost to workers or the taxpayer. In the Baltimore, Washington area alone, union-based apprenticeship programs include over 20 training centers with a combined annual budget of more than $25 million. Union apprenticeship programs have a proven track record of graduating apprentices to journeymen and regularly make capital investments to improve program offerings. Cities like Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and San Francisco have all successfully used project labor agreements to leverage union apprenticeship programs and create career pathways for their residents. Baltimore should join these cities and mandate a PLA, a project labor agreement, on the Port Covington project. Sagamore said earlier that they have met with the unions, and yes, they have made an offer. I just want to make sure that those in the council that are present tonight understand that their offer was that they were going to take away 75% of the prevailing wage on the infrastructure work that's financed. They want to take money away from what should be good wages for Baltimore City residents, and no union agreement. And for that, they want the unions to agree to never picket, not to use any signage, or to disparage the Port Covington project. And that's for the 40 years. So that was their offer. So of course, that's a non-starter with us. We hope that you will encourage them and mandate that they do the right thing. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll be really brief. First, I just want to thank you, Chairman Stokes, for allowing me to speak, and the rest of the council and the committee for allowing me to testify today. But my name is Jermaine Jones, and I'm the business manager of Lyona Local 710 here in Baltimore. I represent over 900 construction workers throughout the Baltimore metropolitan area, majority who live in Baltimore City. Living and growing up here in Baltimore, I've been able to witness firsthand the decline of opportunities for Baltimore City residents. And I'm here to say that if you want to make a real difference in this city and in the lives of its residents, let's not only create jobs, let's create careers. With that said, I'm not looking for or expecting Port Covington to be the sole solution in the poverty here in Baltimore, but they're looking for some assistance from the city, and not just a little assistance, but $535 million worth of assistance. So when I ask you, so we're not here asking for too much. You know, what we're asking for is that before anything gets approved, we need to have an agreement in writing that ensures this development will be built responsibly, creating good jobs with health benefits and family supporting wages and a career path for all Baltimore City residents. Over the last few years, Lyona has committed thousands of hours training Baltimore City residents in preparation for a career in construction. We have all the resources necessary to continue to do so at Port Covington. We realized that many residents had a hard time getting access across town to our training center, so we built a mobile training center where we brought it into communities and provide construction training to local residents. We have certified instructors who can assist and evaluate individuals so that we only produce qualified candidates. The truth of the matter is, we can train all the Baltimore City residents we want, but unless we can put them to work, what are we doing? And the only surefire way to get this accomplished is by having an agreement in writing. Because the developer can come in with the best intentions, but there's no way to know what's going to happen in the future. Just take a look at EBDI. Over 10 years ago, EBDI received a $78 million TIF from the city. And with that TIF, EBDI promised between 6,000 and 8,000 jobs. And in 2005 to 2007, we created an infrastructure for that area. Once they moved over 700 families. An infrastructure that promised there was going to be built houses, there was going to be built retail, and there was going to be hotels there. But in 2008, the housing bubble burst. And what we have there is hardly any of that. And those jobs wasn't created. And when it came to build the few things that are built there, they said we couldn't find local residents to build it. So in closing, what we need here in this city is a comprehensive workforce pipeline that we can begin putting residents to work who are willing and able to go back to work. And that's what we can begin to accomplish here with Port Covington. So in closing, my request is that we shouldn't pass this bill unless there's an amendment in place that'll do just that. Put Baltimore City residents back to work who are willing and able to go to work on family supporting wages with health benefits. Thank you for your support.
Thanks, Jermaine. Good evening, Council Vice Chair, Mr. President, my union brothers and sisters, my brothers and sisters in housing organizations, and the groups from religious organizations. My name is Todd Reynolds. I'm the political coordinator for the American Federation of Teachers, the parent organization of unions like the Baltimore Teachers Union and the City Union of Baltimore. On behalf of AFT Maryland President Marietta English, I am here to tell you that we stand in solidarity with our sisters and brothers in labor and community and religious organizations to ask the city make a better deal on this project, one that includes stronger guarantees for every resident of Baltimore City. We must reiterate that as it currently stands, we, the AFT, cannot support the development deal in Port Covington. In order for us to support it, we demand more be done to make sure this particular deal actually works for the citizens of the city. Of course, we in the AFT demand that legislators do more to assure that public services and education funding are not harmed whatsoever as property values are increased. Regarding education funding particularly, we know that the state legislature passed a temporary solution to this problem last year, a solution that sunsets after 3 years. While we call on the state legislature to pass a more permanent solution in its restructuring of education funding formula, we cannot take it for granted that those efforts will be successful. In order to be sure that public education funding is not at risk, a hold harmless provision, one that assures educational funding on a per pupil basis is not decreased due to rising property values, that hold harmless provision must be included as part of any agreement. In addition, and this hasn't been brought up yet, but this is very important, in addition, that if the developer's estimate is to be believed, nearly 900 new school-aged children will reside in the development area. Yet, only cursory attention has been paid in the development plans to the question of how to provide these students with educational services, relegating that issue to a mere afterthought. As the economic study conducted by the Tischler-Bice consulting firm points out, this development plan as it currently stands, quote, includes no analysis whatsoever or evaluation of current Baltimore City schools infrastructure and whether there is capacity in existing schools to handle this increase in students or if existing bus routes are adequate, unquote. We ask that the developers be required to work with Baltimore City schools and key stakeholders, including but not limited to the union, parent-teacher organizations, community school coordinators, Communities United, the Baltimore Education Coalition, and others, to come up with a plan that will emphasize improving the educational resources available to all children in that region, including the communities of Cherry Hill, Westport, Brooklyn, and Curtis Bay. If a new school is to be built, it must be a traditional school, and the building construction money must come from the TIF proceeds to the developer. Steps must be taken to assure that residents that will be served by this hypothetical newly built school come from a diversity of socioeconomic backgrounds. Again, we stand in solidarity with our labor, community, and religious sisters and brothers in the AFL-CIO, Port 3, Bridge, Build Up Baltimore, and Build, in saying that while this project has the potential to be truly transformative for the city, as it currently is structured, this project will not only exacerbate existing problems. Guarantees must be included to assure that the majority of sustainable jobs go to Baltimore City residents. The developer must adhere to project labor agreements with the building trade unions in the construction of facilities. At least 25% of the housing units must be set aside as affordable housing, subsidized at 30% of AMI, and full transit service must be established to the site with at least 4 bus lines from central Baltimore neighborhoods to Port Covington. The citizens of Baltimore deserve nothing less than a well-thought-out, economically reasonable development plan with enforceable community benefit standards. We don't have that now in this current agreement, but if we can address these issues, we can make this project really work for the people of Baltimore City. Thank you.
Thank you, Council and members of the committee. My name is Michelle Moore. I'm speaking on behalf of AFSCME Council 67. As you know, many people in this room know, we represent thousands of city and school board employees, many of whom live in the city of Baltimore. It's late, so my remarks are going to be short. Just like Todd said, I'm here because AFSCME is standing in solidarity with our brothers and sisters in the labor unions, our brothers and sisters in the community organizations, the advocacy organizations, and the faith-based organizations. AFSCME has a long history of standing in solidarity with community groups, faith, and labor organizations to make a city that works for all Baltimore residents. And it's not easy to work together. And so one of the amazing things to look around this room tonight is we're here and we're working together. And we're working together on something that is very complicated and has been sort of hard for us to even understand. And we've worked hard to understand that our city is not a wealthy city. $535 million is a lot of money. We can't afford to just give it away. We need standards. And so I'm not going to talk about the standards because the standards have been talked about. We've talked about affordable housing, the real standards we need for affordable housing, the standards we need for good jobs and project labor agreements, the standards we need to make sure that our school funding formula still works for the school children of Baltimore and the teachers of Baltimore. So thank you for your time, everybody, the members of the council and everybody who's still here tonight. This is a huge opportunity for us moving forward, but we strongly urge the council to slow the process down so we have the time to consider what needs to be done to make this work for all residents and workers in the city, not just a select few. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, members of the City Council, Chair of the committee. My name is Krista Strothman. I'm the Vice President of Unite Here Local 7, which represents about 3,000 hospitality service workers who mostly live and work in the city of Baltimore. I'm also a 20-year resident of Pigtown in District 10. Port Covington is a large, potentially transformative project that, if it moves forward, will have a big impact on our city and its people. Right now, no commitments have been made about the permanent jobs at Port Covington. Who will get the jobs? What will the wages of these jobs be? And overall, what will the quality of the permanent jobs be? We think this is too important to be left unknown. We should have some idea concretely of what kinds of rights and protections there will be for permanent workers in the future. So, in conclusion, we're here to stand up for good jobs and opportunity for the people of Baltimore. Thank you.
Thank you. Hold on. Before you walk away, Mr. Greco, Councilman Costello.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ernie, always good to see you. And one of the things we've discussed is what I believe is the importance of reaching some type of agreement between Sagamore and the labor trade unions, the building trades. And I see several of the folks in here that we've been talking with, or that I've been talking with. I don't have a mouse in my pocket. That I've been talking with Mark and Melissa from Choice, John from the Carpenters, Dave and Rick from Liuna, Jermaine from Liuna. I saw Gerald from the Plumbers and Steam Fitters floating around. And my understanding is that Sagamore has made an offer. Obviously, that's not satisfactory. At this point, what can we do collectively to see some type of enhanced exchange of ideas back and forth to infuse some energy into those discussions? And I suppose that question is directed at both the labor unions and Sagamore. How do we get everyone in the room?
Well, there's not just one labor union, obviously, as you mentioned, Councilman. And, the building trades has about 15 different unions, and they all are willing to talk to Sagamore. As I mentioned, as the testimony here from ASME that represents city employees, the Baltimore Teachers Union, the transit workers who were here but did not decide to be on the panel with us. But the most important thing, to answer your question, I guess, is to keep talking. One of the things I was happy to hear with Sagamore is that they hired Rhonda Julius, who was the former head of the building trades in the Baltimore area, and hopefully those talks can keep going on. We're ready to talk, and we have good people like Mark Coles and the Tom Hayes represents the Baltimore building trades here. Whenever Sagamore wants to talk, we're more than willing to do that, but it's not just the construction unions, it's those others that I mentioned.
Absolutely, and I certainly appreciate that and agree with that. I know that there's been discussions between Sagamore and AFSCME, Sagamore and Unite Here Local 7, and hopefully those discussions...
No, there hasn't been any agreement with Sagamore and Unite Here.
I said discussions.
Okay.
Is that, am I correct in
with
that?
Who would you say?
Unite Here Local 7?
No,
right. No, I'm not suggesting agreement. I'm suggesting discussions, and
yeah, there's been discussion. The discussions are obviously with the other unions also, but there's been no agreement with anybody.
Okay. Well, I just hope that those discussions can continue and pick up for both parties and continue in good faith. I think that's really important to everyone.
Okay.
Thank you, Councilman. Thank you, Mr. Greco.
And Mr. Chairman, the other individual, Dan Butler, a representative of the Service Employees International Union, the 32BJ, could not make it, but he is going to enter
testimony.
written testimony.
Thank you. Before you walk away, Councilwoman Mary Pat Clark.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I just have to mention, and then I have a question about what it is that Leuna said in its testimony about prevailing wage. I don't understand. This is the second time tonight because Ronnie DeJulius mentioned something about prevailing wage. My question is, and then I would like to take a minute to just tell a story.
Mark, you want to come up and answer that?
I mean, what's going on with prevailing wage? It's the law.
So thank you for the opportunity to answer that. It's been our understanding that 800 million of the 1.1 or 1.3 billion dollars on the infrastructure TIF are going to fall under prevailing wages. And we think that the 800 million is covered by state funds and federal funds. Is that correct? So the proposal that was given to us yesterday evening, and by the way, I'd just like to point out also that I've been very accessible and I've had numerous conversations with Mark Weller and Caroline Paff. You know, they mentioned here earlier tonight that they've reached several agreements with several entities and organizations, but for some reason or another, when it comes to a union building trades agreement, they didn't favor that agreement. So as far as the prevailing wage, what their proposal was to take 25% of the $535 million, and they were consenting to, or they were proposing to have that 25% fall under prevailing wages.
Why is it their decision? I'm missing something. It's not a city.
So maybe you can tell me, Councilwoman. We were under the impression that the $535 million TIF funds were not covered under prevailing wages.
I can't tell you right now the answer, but I see one of our finest attorneys, except when she disagrees with me, sitting here, Hillary Ruley. Would you, if you don't mind, Mr. Chairman, would you please investigate what's being said about prevailing wage, and it might, and clarify it for the committee, and because I haven't read the law, it's a part of the city code, and it does have to do with when we let contracts, but this is our money. At least that part of it should be covered. If it's not union, if the contract is not union, if part of it is non-union, then we're obliged under our own local law to pay prevailing wage, which you know what that is. It's established annually to keep up the competition, so that a non.
No, I actually agree. I actually agree.
Right, so is it possible for the law department? Can you do that for us? And
We need you at the mic, Hillary. Come to the mic if you're going to. Thank you.
The legal question.
Yeah, I'm happy to look into it.
The legal question from me and I asked my colleagues or the labor reps, is this. Given the range of funding sources in this project, and the TIF part, what part of it by law must be covered by prevailing wage if it doesn't go to a union, you know, if they're not union contracts? That's my question. And why is it a matter of negotiation among private parties?
we're happy to look into that. I'm not aware of what the negotiations are or were, but I'm happy to look into the legal question.
Could we have, if you don't mind my asking, Mr. Chairman, could we ask that the labor panel here and the Sagamore people who are in the know about what they're talking about could, before Hillary Ruley leaves this evening, brief her on what the issue is so we know what the opinion is. I think it is that it's being negotiated as if it were an arbitrary thing. We don't need to hear it now, but we just need to have it in writing from Hillary. What's the situation? What's the law?
There's a gentleman behind who wants to come forward. We'll let him.
Yeah, just as a point of information, my name is Greg Leroy. I'm the Executive Director of Good Jobs First, and I have several other things to say about the project, but I'll just answer this one specific question. So to answer your question, madam, the state of Maryland does not attach prevailing wage to TIF.
I'm sorry.
The state of Maryland does not attach prevailing wage to TIF yet. Pennsylvania does, New Jersey, California, Oregon, the cities of Pittsburgh, Denver, and New York all attach prevailing wage to TIF and other redevelopment monies. And I think it would be a prudent thing for Maryland and Baltimore to do the same thing.
We have a local Baltimore City prevailing wage law. So we got time to amend it if that's what we need to do.
Yes. There you go.
Ms. Papp.
Sure. Thank you,
Sure.
Mr. Chairman. So there are numerous levels of financing in this project, and Mark was correct about that. The state and the federal is actually subject to prevailing wage, and there's no question about that at all. The Baltimore City infrastructure, if it is done under contract by the developer, is not subject to prevailing wage by the law. If the contracts are let by the Board of Estimates, it is subject to prevailing wage. So
Well, then,
there is a difference.
In other words, all we have to do is amend the law to say it is. I mean, I hear what you're saying, and I haven't read it for years. It came up twice, and so that's why I'm asking the law department, because I don't want to go off on a tangent here, but it's a little too late, because we have our own wage commission and our own prevailing wage, and the Build people who are still in the House know that the way we got living wage was because we could demonstrate through prevailing wage that we had the authority to do it locally. So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cause a stir, but this is kind of local, and we should be able to solve it. So I did want to say one thing about the testimony from Unite Here, Local 7, and Michelle Moore and AFSCME. One of the most important parts of labor agreements is the employment on a location after it's built. So I'll take 1 minute to tell you a story that is what I live by. There was a man named Tom Bradley. He had Ernie Greco's position, head of the Metro, AFL-CIO. Many years ago when we were creating Harbor Place, The Hyatt wanted to come, but there was a $20 million gap. They couldn't close the gap. Tom Bradley and his locals and his council agreed with the Hyatt that if they would observe labor peace and allow people to sign up for unions who worked at the Hyatt, he would support and his unions would support the $20 million UDAG from the federal government. We got the UDAG, we built the Hyatt, 1979 to 2014, people couldn't organize. People were stopped from organizing to form a union in the Hyatt hotels. It got so bad, the whole nation full of Hyatts, and prominently our own, gave up finally. But that's what happens when it's done on a handshake and a word among very good people.
Mr. Chair, just two quick things. I'm going to have David has a point that he wants to make, and then I'm going to ask Mark Coles, as for the benefit of the folks here that don't know what the prevailing wage means, he will explain it.
Okay, listen, I have one more person, and we have to close the building in 10 minutes. You have to do it for me in 30 seconds. Is that possible? Go ahead. Don't hesitate.
The point I wanted to make was that Councilmember Costello earlier, he asked a question, why have the negotiations with Sagamore stalled out? Why isn't it going anywhere? And as I pointed out previously, the one offer they've made is to take away 75% of prevailing wage on the infrastructure that Baltimore City's paying for. They want to take away from the workers, the Baltimore City workers. They want to pay low wages with no health insurance, no retirement, no representation, so they can treat the workers any way they want. That's why there is no deal done right now. They're going to have to come to the table and not want to take away from Baltimore City residents. That's why there's no deal done. That's what needs to happen to get something done, is they need to not take away, they need to be able to pay living wages to Baltimore residents. Thank you.
Councilman, wait a minute, Councilman.
Thanks, Dave.
So I don't know. So just so everybody understands, I mean, prevailing wages don't give the unions any unfair advantage to get to work. It just ensures that all contractors are competing and putting in bids at the same rate and the same benefit package. You know, and just quickly, council member, prevailing wages are city and state surveys are taken yearly to determine what's the prevailing wages for certain classifications in a particular area, and they compile that information and then they issue a statement saying that the wages for certain classifications will be X, Y, and Z, and then those wages are posted on jobs.
Thank you. Councilman Costello.
Thank you. Mark and Dave, just so there's no confusion on my part, I want to be explicitly clear that I would like to see some type of agreement. I have no confusion about why there has not been an agreement. The simple answer to that is both parties don't agree. So I understand that, and all I'm asking is because of how important I think it is to me and several of my colleagues that those discussions continue in good faith, so that we can get to a place where there is agreement because of how important this is. So I just want to reiterate that there's no confusion about why agreement hasn't been reached, just reiterating that I think everyone would like to see agreement.
Thank you, Councilman, and thank you, Labor. We appreciate that. Is Greg Leroy? Greg, you still with us? Of course.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll keep it brief because there's a lot of water in the dam. My name is Greg Leroy. I direct a nonprofit group called Good Jobs First. We're a watchdog group on economic development subsidies. I've written 2 books on this subject. I want to applaud your decision tonight to do it right, slow down, not take a quick vote, not fast track the deal. Really applaud that. This is the biggest proposed TIF project in Maryland state history. It would be the 3rd biggest in U.S. history. if you get this wrong, you risk really hurting the city financially, dividing the city even more than it already is. I just really applaud what you're doing. TIF is an enormously contentious subject in many other big cities in this country. If you go to Chicago or Kansas City or Arizona or St. Louis, you can find long-term damage done to the fiscal condition of cities and the economies of regional metro economies by the misuse and overuse of tax increment financing. Tischler-Bice was right tonight when they said that the market assumptions behind the MuniCap document must be made public. We're now privy to a little bit of some of the market assumptions from what's been said tonight, and they just raise more questions. For instance, we now have the market assumption that employment at Under Armour is going to continue to soar. That's a market assumption. We know from the response document Monday from MuniCap that 90% of the office space in the project site is projected to be Under Armour. That's a very robust assumption about Under Armour's trajectory. It assumes that nobody else will be as disruptive in the market as they have, or that its competitors won't fight back to take market share. This is the definition of putting too many eggs in one basket. It's a very risky strategy. A very risky financial strategy, a very risky market strategy.
Mr. Leroy, just a second.
Sure.
I know that some have decided to leave. I got to tell you, please, those in the back, would you leave the building, please, or not speak so that we can hear? This building captures sound. So I'm asking those in the rear to either leave the building or not to speak while the speaker is speaking. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Another market assumption is that there's going to be this robust absorption of space for manufacturing. Yet, employment for manufacturing in the state of Maryland has gone down 25%, more than 25% in the last 10 years. It's gone down the last 20 years. It's gone down the last 30 years. I would love manufacturing to have a renaissance, but that's not the market trend. So we need to see the market assumptions behind those absorption projections for the manufacturing space. And finally, in the response that issued Monday, MuniCap does also lay out some assumptions about who's going to live in Port Covington and who's not, by what kind of public services it says will be needed. It assumes there won't be any non-insured or underinsured people with substance abuse problems or mental health needs, no mothers with HIV, no residents seeking to quit smoking, no seniors with cognitive impairments, nobody having their asthma triggered even though they're living underneath an interstate highway. That's a novel idea. So, you know, it's the definition of two Baltimores if you're talking about not having populations like that would need service in an area like that. Again, you could attach prevailing wage to this in the same way many states and cities do. And I applaud your efforts to slow it down and get it right. Thank you.
Great. Do you have a copy of your testimony? Mr. Leroy, did you bring a copy of your testimony that we could have or no? Thank you, sir. Okay, again, with apologies to those we have not called this yet, we're going to recess the hearing.
When you going to let the
and we will bring the hearing back together. We will reconvene the hearing next week, same time, probably in this building, but there will be an announcement of the hearing, but we're looking to do it at 5 o'clock on time this next week. On Wednesday, was that the 3rd or the August 3rd. But we will have an announcement by this Friday, and it will be on the website, and we'll send it out to the list of folk who are here tonight if they have left us contact information. Thank you all so much. Taxation, Finance, and Economic Development is now in recess.